welcome back. If you are here for the first time, I recommend listening to the earlier parts of this story so the path will be clear to you. And for those who have already followed this journey, thank you for returning. Your support means more than you know. Now, let us begin.
Rain kept its slow dominion. It threaded from the roofs of the fortress, ran the faces of stones until they shone without joy, slipped from the rims of helmets and the edges of shields in thin cords that vanished into mud already convinced to. Except more, the night belonged to water and to waiting. Between the outer ditch and the line of pines, the Ronin camp held to a hush learned by long hours. Torches hooded and hissing, banners hung heavy and obedient, voices reduced to the work of breath. Wet cloth clung to backs, and every knot was taught a new patience. Takeshi stood at the margin where trampled earth became the field's darker skin. A straw hat sent a neat circle of water from its brim with each small shiver of wind, the drops falling with a disciplined cadence onto his shoulders and then down along the coarse weave of his coat. He did not move to adjust it. His gaze held to the walls, dark, immense, a shape the rain could not persuade to soften. The stone had learned. The storm's vocabulary and would outlast it. Watchfires burned along the towers as embers, each held behind a lip of soaked wood that let light exist without becoming a claim. From within, drums murmured at intervals, the sound traveling through the belly of the castle and into the earth. A message stones understood better than men. Not call to arms, not celebration, only the keeping of time by an interior hand. Beside him, Nobu stood with the steady unease of a young tree in wind. He held his sword as one holds a thing that could slip if not kept on his fingers around the lacquered scabbard, thumb searching out the familiar cord below the guard. Breath misted, drew thin in the wet, and returned to his mouth carrying the taste of smoke and rain. The camp's smell was a single braid of damp pine, wet soil, oil that resented the water but performed its duty, and beneath it all, the faint iron that sleep gives to steel when storms are near. He listened to his breath and found it too high. He lowered it, thought of lowering it, and lowered it again. Beneath the walls, the ground made a slow grammar of footsteps. Mud received solace with a soft suction that wrote the truth of weight and gave it back as a sigh when men moved on. A spear butt settled into the rim of a puddle with the sound of a patient cup finding a saucer. The hiss of torches kept modest time. The fat in them burned unwillingly and was persuaded by heat to concede. Banners no longer devices so much, as dark cloth with memory lifted the breadth of a finger and fell. They had taken on rain as a burden and were not yet ready to give it up. The fortress rose as a decision already made. Watercourses cut along its stone faces gathered rain into orderly seams and let it vanish where mouths and the masonry drank. Arrow slits watched without blinking, their darkness unaffected by the watchfire's modest pulse. Under the gate tower, the heavy underbeam gleamed darker than the rest oiled against a season that could not be argued with. No voice called, no lantern swung in greeting or rebuke. The house had shut its mouth and kept its ears. Takeshi shifted his weight the width of a grain. The brim above him poured 2 neat strings of water in response, then calmed. He neither leaned on the past nor pressed on the future, but he let both live near enough to be felt. Kazuo returned to him where rain keeps such names, not as vision, not as wound, only as a pressure behind the ribs that reminded the body of its own shape. He remembered the emblem recovered from snow, the neck worn smooth by years and then made sharp again by a winter's cold. He remembered Sayori's whisper, "The silence will break with blood," and felt how the night had come to the place in its sentence where the next word weighed more than the rest. Within the camp, small labor continued without voice. A man pinched. A wick with wet fingers felt the torch complain and then behave. Another tested a strap, pulled at another hole with a patience that had been earned by smaller mistakes. A third poured water from a helmet, let it fall, listened to the way it struck earth, and shook the last few drops away as if correcting a child. No one cleaned a blade here. There was nothing to remove yet. Mud took prints and began to forget. Then, as Rain requested, a kettle nestled in coals shaded by a tile found the exact temperature for quiet steam, and the breath of tea joined the air as a courtesy both brief and sufficient. A crow passed above the ditch, its wings made heavy by wet air. It offered the single flat syllable that had always been enough and moved on to a parapet where stones warmed it only by the memory of days. The drums within spoke again, 3 slow hearts in a rest. The sound went into the soil and returned thinner, as if the earth had tasted it, approved, and decided to keep a portion. Breathe, Takeshi said, and the word found Nobu without seeking. Yes, the boy answered, the shape of the sound small enough not to disturb Rain. The Ronin leader came and stood not quite beside them, patched. Sleeve rain dark, beard collecting drops that formed and fell. His presence carried the work of the day without any of its noise. He looked at the walls for a time, the kind of looking that counts without numbers, then lowered his gaze to the ditch and the apron of stone beyond. He did not ask a question. His hands spoke for him as they rested and did not clench. Night holds, he said at last. The remark is descriptive and sufficient as a weather note. It does, Takeshi said. Until it doesn't, the leader added, and the 3 of them accepted the sentence's second half as the truth that made the first. Worth saying. Rain found new paths on armor. It traced the lines where plates met, found the small valleys and cords, ran the thong knots that closed sleeves and left them darker by degrees. It met wood and made of it a different sound than on steel, a rounder tap, a lower kind of counting. It met earth and ceased to be itself, becoming the ground string, vanishing into dark that was only partly darkness. Nobu listened to those differences and assigned them, without pride, their places: wood, iron, soil, hat brim, spear shaft, plank, stone, leather, rope. He stood with his blade at an angle that pleased the shoulder and the wrist both, and found that his hands no longer trembled. Or rather, they trembled in a way that told the truth without insisting upon it. Men moved along the line with bundles of reed and matting, reinforcing what ditches had been persuaded to be walls. They spoke in syllables small enough to fit between. Drops, here, lift, hold. No one bothered to name the hour. The storm had taken that duty for itself and was performing it handsomely. Every so often a torch sputtered, pulled into a brief flare by gust, then huddled back to its modest posture like a monk who had stood too quickly in a cold temple. Within the fortress, a lamp turned in a high room and threw a sideways band of yellow across a gallery. It moved by the hand of someone who wanted the walls to know he could move light, and then set it down again where it made the least intrusion. Nobu watched it come and go, saw nothing of the man, and felt the old shape of the house in his chest as a room without windows. He did not try to enter. He had learned to wait at doors. Takeshi stood with Rain riding his hat and coat and read what the night allowed. He watched the drip from the lowest board of the gate tower, counting a rhythm that would go on until someone decided it should not. He watched water find the groove carved by old siege ladders and follow it as if to rehearse. He watched a pale strip of moss gather brightness from torches and return it as a dull consent. He let his thoughts carry the oiled packet seal. In his sleeve as weight, not instruction. Words set in wax do not know what Rain knows. A low order moved through the camp, not to ready, not to sleep, to hold. The leader's hand made a small motion, and men accepted it as if the motion had been in their blood all day, waiting for a reason to show. Cloaks were set tighter, straw coats shaken once, straps checked that had been checked. No one found anything new, and this was a relief. Nobu's fear sat beside him like a guest who had finally learned the rules of the house. It did not try to speak over other voices, it kept its hands folded. It reminded him that the blade in his hand would always be too sharp for any kind of vanity. He recalled, not with a spike, but with a steady weight, the first man he had unmade in the mountain pass, how the rain then had erased much of what had happened and left him with his breath. Tonight the rain promised to keep secrets again, and that too was a mercy and a judgment. He turned his head 1 degree. Takeshi's face lay in darkness where the brim shaded it, only the wet line of the jaw and the dim shine on cheekbones showing how the light found purchase. The older man's stillness comforted and warned. It said, "Do not mistake quiet for gentleness. Do not mistake readiness for a desire to use it." It said what weather says to fields that have known drought and flood both. Stand. Grow where you can. Root correctly. Under the straw hat, Takeshi considered the walls and felt, as he often did near large rooms, the presence of a smaller room inside him that neither belonged to the house nor refused it. Sayori's last whisper touched the rim of that room, and fell back. Silence will break with blood. The blade that rests will awaken, and he let it take its seat without announcing itself to the others. He was not the storm. He was a man in weather, which is enough. The drums shifted tempo within, not faster or louder. Different. 4, rest, 1, rest. A pattern that made sense only to men who had been standing at those galleries so long that the rooms learned their weight. The sound traveled outward, struck, rain, and changed, as if the storm had the right to edit. Torches along the parapets brightened by a finger's width, then returned to their economy. Somewhere beyond the gate, a chain lifted and laid down again, metal talking to metal in a tone that had no interest in human ears. Nobu swallowed and found the taste of smoke and wet wood held by the back of his tongue. He took a breath the size of the space between the next 2 drum beats and let it go. "Master," he said, and the word did not carry farther than Takeshi's shoulder. Will it be here?" He did not say what it was. The night supplied that with generosity. "If not here," Takeshi said, "it will pretend to be elsewhere." "Yes." "Stand to the work," Takeshi said, the old instruction made new by rain. "Yes," Nobu said again, and the word sat. Better in his mouth this time. The leader moved away and returned with a roll of matting under an arm. He set it by a gap and weighed it down with a stone that had agreed to serve as a tool. He did this himself, though there were hands enough, because it matters to do simple work when the hour grows abstract. When he finished, he came back to Takeshi and Nobu and looked again at the walls. If he spoke, it was to the weather, the fortress. Answered the night with the sound walls make, the sleep of large purpose. Water worked the joints, wood gave to keep from breaking. Wayne slid along parapets and thought better of climbing. Somewhere in the rooms beyond, a clerk's brush tapped against a stone, and a word became another word. The house breathed with the caution of a sick man who refuses to admit illness. Time slowed further, as if the rain had asked it to learn a better pace. The camp's small movements became the whole hour, a torch being pinched and fed, a knot tested. A cloak's edge straightened where it had begun to funnel water. A hand passing a ladle to another without claiming to be generous. The earth took these things and turned them into memory without needing any of their names. The ditch filled by a degree and then stopped shy of trouble. A frog, surprised, found itself promoted to witness and disappeared privately. Nobu's attention wandered to the edge of the field where grass, bent by feet, tried to stand. The blades lifted in slow lines as if recalled by rank and file. His fear watched and learned. He thought of the shrine and its bell that would not ring without a hand, of the prayer slips that had tried to read the night and ended as wet paper. He thought of Kensei behind walls, his hands open on a low table, listening to the storm and to men who had learned to speak while wishing to be weather. He thought of Dago and of the way a room becomes smaller when a certain kind of voice fills. It dot across the ditch, at the foot of the wall. A white scrap clung to a weed and shivered when rain took it for a feather. It was not a feather, it was torn cloth. He let it be whatever it wanted to be and did not seek a lesson. Where none had been offered, the drums within ceased for the space of 10 breaths. In that pause, rain became louder without changing its mind. The torches hissed more distinctly. The line of men listened harder in a way that makes the ears correct themselves. Then, as if a teacher had re-entered the room, the drums resumed, their new pattern now declaring itself to be old, and the camp allowed its shoulders a fraction of release that did not reach the hands. A runner came along the rear, mud to his knees, hair tied high and leaking water. He did not run at the front. He spoke to the leader, spoke to another, and kept moving. His words, being practical, had no interest in ceremony. "Hold," he said to one group. "Hold," to the next. As if the message were a map being unrolled evenly along a floor. He reached Takeshi and stopped because the body sometimes knows what the mouth intends and carries it without finishing. "Hold," he said. "We are." Takeshi answered. The runner glanced at Nobu with the quick nod men give when they recognize a younger version of their own day. He moved on, leaving behind the smell of wet cloth and the smaller, sharper scent of lacquer gone dull with rain. The ground swallowed the prints of his feet too eagerly and then regretted its appetite. Takeshi's hand rested, where it always rested, near but not on the knot that kept his blade correct. He had made a habit of not touching what he would need. Habit had rewarded him by being ready when he was not. He looked once at the sky and found nothing but low cloud, the color of steel that has not yet learned polish. No stars. No moon. The night had taken everything into itself and offered back only the sentence it would complete in its own time. He closed his eyes long enough to find the room within and opened them again to give the world back to itself. The walls were still. The walls. The rain still the rain. Nobu still the boy becoming the man he feared and respected. The leader still the man who kept 3 jobs in one body without advertisement. The drum still the drum. The earth still the earth. They waited there in the clean weight of inevitability. The torches, refusing to be brilliant, persisted. Banners lifted and fell with a patience that was almost rude in its steadiness. The fortress breathed behind its sealed mouth. Rain learned every plank and every plate and every seam it would need to name in the hour to come. Mud accepted, yielded, recorded, forgot. Nobu breathed until the breathing became the hour's other work. Takeshi stood, the straw hat dripping at its rim, eyes steady upon the dark stone that would decide nothing and hold everything. No horn sounded, no gate moved, no arrow declared itself. Only drums continued their low conversation with the walls, and water answered, and men held. The uneasy silence before the first clash grew heavier, not with threat, but with certainty, as if the night had wrapped both camps in the same wet cloth and asked them to discover, at the same instant, what kind of truth it was willing to let them keep. Night thickened rather than fell, each new layer of darkness settling upon the last until even the watchfires on the towers seemed to breathe under a weight. The rain learned a heavier hand. It struck wood with a round, insistent tapping. It wrote long, slant lines on shields and soaked them until grain swelled. It beat a finer music on oiled helmets and slid off with a restrained gleam. Earth gave itself to water, and the ground took on the honest smell of turned soil and trampled grass, a scent that mixed with smoke and wet leather and the sour trace of pitch to make the air taste of toil. The camp held its hush until the hush cracked It was not a shout that did it, nor any word. It was the first arrow, one breath, one bright hiss near the ear, a quick embroidery across the rain. It thudded into a bundled reed screen with the sound of a hand slapping wet cloth. A man looked toward it without moving the rest of his body. Another whisper followed, and another. Thin stitching began to pierce the dark, each shaft writing its lone syllable of iron into wood, into earth, into the accidental hollows men leave when shoulders make rooms. Against one another, Nobu felt the sound before he saw any form. The hiss cut the rain and then dissolved in it. He lifted his shield with both hands and set it to the angle the hour demands, chin tucked, wrist straight, elbow without bravado. Drops ran along the board and gathered at the lower edge before falling in a neat bead run. He listened for the next bright ss and found in the listening that his fear had been waiting for this shape. Almost relieved to be given a name to carry, along the ditch a low call traveled. Shields, and the men answered with the old, simple economy, wood. Raised as one creature, then settled. Spears brought upright and then lowered to keep their points from drawing lightning to themselves. Bowstrings checked under cloaks. Cords tightened a quarter turn by hands that knew the grain of leather better than the lines on their palms. A few murmured a phrase to no one in particular threadbare. Wisdoms handed down the way bowls are words that would not change the weather and would not try, but would place the mouth in a shape the heart recognized as teadying dot from the tower. A drumbeat altered its count. The fortress breathed in and then answered in fire. Arrows lifted from behind the parapets and rose on their small, stubborn flames, each knot of pitch cupped against wind by a hood of wet cloth. They traced red seams across the storm, brief strokes that made the rain look like a curtain the sky drew open just for them. For a moment they shone with the pride of their making. Then they fell into the honest gravity of mud and water, hissing, dimming, biting into boards with a spitting spark, or vanishing with a soft kiss into the earth, their embers swallowed whole. One lodged in the raw edge of a shield and burned like a stubborn thought until rain taught it humility. Another struck a standing post and slid down the slick, leaving a black tear that widened slowly. Men did not cry out. They moved in tense rhythm. Lift, brace, breathe, hold, exhale, here. A shield leaned into a gust and took the slant of wind, as if it were instruction. A spear butt sank a finger's width deeper into soft ground and steadied. A bowman under a straw cape set an arrow to string by feel alone and sent it toward the places, between watchfires where darkness lives more. Confidently, the shot made no claim. It joined the night the way a drop joins a stream. Takeshi stood among them and did not sway. The brim of his straw hat poured steady lines. Water traced his jaw and vanished into his collar. Arrows wrote their thin pronunciations around him, and he let them pass the way a river lets small stones roll along its bottom. His presence made a still room in motion, no larger than a mat, no smaller than a breath, an emptiness that gave men a shape to fit their backs against. Without touching him at all, he did not lift a shield. He did not draw. He measured the storm by the sum of its hisses and the way the drums within the walls taught the rain its gait, a glow streak low and broke in a puddle, oil flaring a petal of light that the downpour snuffed at once. The brief brightness sketched faces, cheekbones in wet bronze, eyes under the shadows of rims, lips parted in the involuntary way men have when counting things that move too quickly to be seen and too slowly to be ignored. The camp breathed with the rhythm of laborers at a mill, uneven, then corrected, then uneven again. Nobu's hands trembled at the first contact, the weight of a shaft striking the plank. It set the wood ringing with a small, shocked note that traveled through wrist to elbow and taut bone the news. He adjusted without thinking, heel digging for better ground, shoulder finding a lower angle. A murmur rose and fell around him. Someone asking for the name of a saint and receiving only rain. Someone promising rice to a household altar if the altar would consent to do the untidy work of a shield. He tasted pitch in the wet. It came to his tongue the way a bitter medicine returns to scald the throat after swallowing. Fire-tipped shafts continued to arc. Fewer now, brighter for being fewer. Some met water at height and died, their last glow seen in the eye rather than on the earth. A little star winked out by the insistence of the storm. Others found their mark and cramped there, a slow ember working backward along the shaft until a hand or rain or simple sense ended it. One stuck in a rolled mat and smoked as if the roll contained breath. The man who owned it pressed his palm to the smoke and left it there, until the mat remembered that it was meant to be wet. From the dark of the field opposite the wall, arrows also came unflamed, their presence declared only by the straight threads of sound they drew between men and parapet. These were the crueler, somehow, for their lack of spectacle, each a private negotiation with wood and cloth and skin and luck. One slapped mud an inch from a bare heel, lifted a bright fleck that died mid-air. Another split the handle of a bucket and left it absurdly upright with water pouring out its side in a narrow, patient stream. Another struck the rim of a gong that had not been struck in years and sounded a low note that surprised even itself. Nobu dared a glance in the intervals. Between red seams and black hisses, the fortress showed itself in pieces, the underside of a balcony weeping water. The line of a slit with an eye behind it, then no eye. A crane-dark banner limp, the crest refusing drama. The shine of rain on a chain that lay against stone and did not yet lift. He saw the shape of a man moving behind a slit and felt neither anger nor invitation from it, only the neutrality of work done indoors. He drew his gaze back to where his hands needed it. Arrows came thicker. The sky learned the look of thin reeds being shaken and drawn. Their sound made a woven thing in the ears hiss and snap and thrum, and the little reluctant tug at wood when a shaft is pulled free and set aside. The drums within the walls stopped for 3 heartbeats. In their absence, the rain was louder and more intimate, a hand on the back of the neck. When the drums returned, they were slower by a measure, as if some decision had completed its journey from one room to another. Men lifted shields and lowered them, in a choreography not taught but inherited through jobs shared, through old stories, told without adjectives, through watching the way water finds the low places and accepting that this too is instruction. A boy of perhaps Nobu's years whispered a line into the hollow made by his forearm and the plank, and then kissed the wet edge without embarrassment. An older man, lips moving with a prayer learned in a season of famine, kept time by tapping, his thumb against his spear shaft. Words here were tools as much as blades were, used, put down, not sharpened for anyone else's admiration. A fire arrow fell short, met the flooded edge of the ditch, and lay there making steam in a tired way, until the coal in its tip surrendered. Another struck a shield at the far left of the line, burned with more desire than sense, and a hand reached without panic to pluck it and plant it headfirst in the sucking mud. The ember hissed out as if offended to be used so correctly. Takeshi turned his head the width of a grain to mark where the darkest part of the storm was traveling. Wind set all arrows from the wall to a slight drift. He knew the hands on the parapet would correct for it, and that the correction would make its own mistake because men are not wind. The thought did not comfort and did not need to. He felt Nobu's unease standing within reach and shared with it the agreement that unease could stay if it would mind its manners. Breathe, he said once more, a line that did not try to outrun rain double quotes yes. Nobu answered, his voice a clean thread in the wet air. A shaft grazed the rim of Nobu's. hat and went on to dig its face into the ground with a wet sound that made him think of a tea whisk dipped too hard. He smiled without meaning to at the thought and then forgot it, as a kindness should be accepted and set down. The plank in his hands grew heavier with water, and with the arrows that stuck in it like uneaten fish bones. He learned the new weight and let it become the old one. The fortress dimmed its fire arrows for a time, perhaps to keep their pitch dry under some eve, perhaps to listen to what rain could accomplish unaided. Unlit shafts returned to being the world's main grammar. Their hiss came at different heights and angles, teaching the ear a range of slopes, some low and humbling, some high and resigned. In that sibilant canopy, the murmurs of men were small ground creatures, brief, skittering, choosing their moments. One voice near Takeshi said a single name and let it be carried away by water. Another voice tried to sing 2 notes and gave up quietly. Some arrows found nothing and discovered, for the first time, the decent comfort of mud. Some lodged in a carpenter's work and learned the taste of resin. A few met shields carrying prayers and were asked to behave. None announced victory. This was not victory. This was the beginning of a storm playing its first music in a room of men who had entered it with eyes open. Nobu wondered what the archers saw from the wall. If the line of raised shields looked like a low gray tide with no horizon, if the torches of the camp seemed humble as insects' eyes. He imagined the glow of their own fire arrows seen from above, a rain of short-lived stars that make the sky look iron briefly and then dark again. He found that the imagining calmed him, not out of romance, but because it made other men human. Across stone-dot rain pressed harder. The straw of Takeshi's hat yielded and recovered, the brim's constant beads growing fatter, then looser. A shaft struck the hat's edge and skittered, leaving behind a small torn fringe that would please no tailor. Takeshi did not correct it. He let the night keep its small trophy and continued to count the spaces between volleys. The fortress's rhythm had shifted again, 3 rest, 2 rest. It meant something to the men who lived behind that wood and stone. It meant patience to those outside. The ground near the ditch turned to a skin of standing water with eyes, the flat circles that ripple and vanish, ripple and vanish. Fire arrows that fell into it announced themselves with brief flowers that opened and were cut by rain at once. Smoke moved low and stubborn, possessing the damp with the confidence of an old tenant. It smelled pine pitch, the faint sweetness of singed straw coiled with the earth's damp breath and the leather's honest musk. Nobu breathed all 3 and learned to tell them apart without looking. Once, a shield failed, not with noise, with a meek surrender. Its board split along the line where a knot had lived unloved. The man behind it lowered the broken halves in a smooth motion and stepped half a pace to a neighbor who widened his stance to meet him. No words. Later there would be time to bind. The split with reed and sinew and memory. Now the gap received its patch of human steadiness, a clutch of arrows, sent together from some unseen signal, rattled into the reed rampart with a sound like rain grown impatient. Reed bent, reed whined, reed endured. A hand rose behind it to press a brace and left it there long enough for the whine to ease. That hand had a ring scar where a cord once burned skin and taught it a lesson that had not been forgotten. The scar shone briefly in a flare and settled back into anonymity. The night offered its one moment of pageantry. A heavy volley of fire arrows lifted into wind and, for an instant, made a ceiling of red threads. It was not a banner, not a show of strength, only the geometry of many hands doing the same task at the same time. The arcs turned over and fell. Some died high, snuffed by the wet. Some died mid-flight, their embers pinched into black, even as the shaft continued on with a quieter purpose. Some reached ground and made that small, urgent chatter that asks for kindling and is refused. Men raised shields and bowed their heads, and the arrows finished speaking without needing anyone to answer. Takeshi closed his eyes once, not to withdraw, to feel the room without the world's image. In that pause, the noise arranged itself into truer ranks, reign over everything, arrows our ancestors would recognize by ear, breath of men, drum within the wall, the quiet that lives under all of it like bedrock. He opened his eyes to the same storm and the same necessary work and found Nobu exactly where he should be. Hold. The leader's voice traveled, unembellished. Hold, came the low replies, like stones passing a weight along without dropping. The volley slackened. The fortress's drums settled into their dull interior, counting again, as if reminded that a siege is more waiting than striking. The last fire arrow found a patch of flattened grass and failed without complaint. Final hiss marked the end of a streak that had started somewhere men were not welcome. Rain, grateful for work without argument, deepened its hand and smoothed the ground's new scars as much as it could in 1 hour. Arrows lay at angles, some upright like thin markers placed by a herd surveyor, some drawn to the fletching, some still shivering slightly as if reluctant to be done. Shields showed their fresh wounds, black smears, bright splits, the neat bite of iron teeth. Smoke thinned to a gray thought. The smell of wet leather returned to dominance, stubborn and homely, a reassurance that men are heavier than their instruments. Nobu lowered his shield and set its edge in the mud. He flexed his fingers, each joint reporting itself in order. The trembling had become a low hum somewhere deeper than the hands, the body's quiet proclamation. I was asked to stand and dead. He exhaled and tasted rain that had found its way between his lips. It was cool and sour and cleaned out around him. The murmurs changed. Men spoke in low inventory. Arrow, here, unbroken, thine later. An older prayer half muttered, half sung threaded through and made a weave the arrows could not tear. Someone laughed once, a small raised thing like a hinge tested after repair. It died of embarrassment and was forgiven. Takeshi remained as he had been, a stone set where water chooses to go. He placed one hand on the plank of a nearby shield to steady it against a gust, and left the hand there as if resting on the shoulder of a friend. He looked to the parapet not for answers, but for more weather, and the parapet gave him neither. Inside, a lamp moved once. The drum stayed where it had decided to be. The world resumed its deeper pulse, the one that outlasts arrows. And drums both. No cry of victory came, nor defeat. The night, having made its first pronouncement, declined to explain itself further. The camp breathed, the fortress counted, rain kept the ledger. The first breath of battle had been taken, measured, corrected, endured. It had not overwhelmed. It had made of men and wood and earth a single wet instrument, and asked it to hold a note. They held it. Nobu stood with his shield in the mud, and his sword still sleeping in its house. He listened to the quiet after arrows, and discovered that it was larger than the quiet before. In that larger room, his fear found a smaller chair. Takeshi's stillness took on a shade of acceptance, not of fate, but of craft. The storm played on. The night, the walls, the men, all understood that more would come. For now, they stood in the space between and the rain, satisfied with being the only honest messenger, fell without hurry. Rain pressed lower until the night felt like a roof brought down to shoulder height. The field before the fortress turned to a slow-moving skin of water where prints filled as soon as they were made, and reed bundles darkened into one color. Torches smoldered beneath hoods and gave off a subdued light, the flame more sound than brightness, a whispering cough, a wet sigh, a thin hiss when a drop found the ember's throat and silenced it. From within the walls, the drum kept its inner mathematics 4. Rest, 2 each stroke absorbed by stone, translated by timbers, and returned to the ground as a dull, constant certainty. Along the ditch, men set planks and reed mats in close lines, boots testing each board with a careful heel before committing the weight of a cart. The carts were low and broad, their wooden sides tar black, heaped with bundles of brush and split timber sodden with oil, pitch worked into the seams like dark marrow. Ropes creaked in wet knots, axles spoke their small complaints. A wheel sank, a hand's breadth, and rose again under shoulders that had argued with fields before they argued with war. No one urged speed. Rain had taken the right to set the tempo. The carts moved as weather moves, persistent, almost indifferent in how it refuses to be refused. Takeshi stood a little forward of the line, the straw hat bending under its bead-rimmed burden, sending down steady threads of water that unspooled along the coat and fled into the ground. He watched without counting. The gate tower loomed above, its lower beam a dark horizon, its eaves weeping in 4 directions, its arrows slit small, fixed eyes that never blinked. The great doors, discolored by seasons and grease, bore iron straps that shone briefly and then hid the shine. Water ran from join to join and disappeared into channels carved by a century of storms. The gate knew water. It had learned to drink it with discipline. Tonight the men meant to teach it fire. Nobu, at Takeshi's left and half a step back, held his sword against his side as if any looseness in him might persuade the blade to slip away and take courage with it. His breath met the night in quick. Clouds thinned, sank, returned carrying the bitter of pitch and the earth's clean dampness. His eyes stung not from fear, but from smoke that did not yet have a right to exist out here and insisted anyway. He watched the low shapes of men moving under straw capes, each shape pushing a cart as if it were part of his own body that had gone heavy. When a gust took a hooded torch and made it devour its own smoke, the small flare painted faces for it. Moment cheekbones like wet stone, jaws set to the same work, eyes steady because they had chosen to be. Steady, someone said, not loudly, and a dozen hands agreed. The first cart reached the apron at the gate's base. A hook pole lifted one bundle from its load and tucked it beneath the overhang where rain reached less eagerly. An oiled rag already lit, already protesting the weather with a bright seriousness, kissed the pitch and shared its orange without ceremony. Flame found wet wood and had to be taught how to live there. It crept along the darker seams with a sound like paper reluctantly uncrumpling, took the glossy skin of tar into itself, seethed and stuttered, caught again where oil had, gathered into a patient bead. Smoke lifted in slow ropes, thick at first, then pulled thin by wind, and the smell came forward. Sharp pine made sour by heat, animal fat notes from old bindings, wet timber changing its mind about which element owned it. From above, an arrow struck the cart's rim and rattled off. Another found a bundle and stayed, trembling as fire licked back along its shaft until rain pinched the ember to black. A stone followed, weighty and blunt, tumbling in a series of dull, wet thuds before coming to rest too short to matter. No curses answered it. The men pushed the second cart in, placed its cargo in a lattice against the first, and gave fire the second lesson, not one flame arguing for itself, but many agreeing to share their purpose. The hiss and crackle were different. On wet wood, each sound were rain. Flame bunched and flattened under gusts, then rose in small banners that had no crest, each a soft orange folded by water into a more solemn color. Steam went up in delicate sheets, caught sparks, and ushered them higher, then broke apart into ghosts the night took back. The gates began to darken, not from wet, but from heat, the surface gloss turning matte, the grain lifting, a blister the size of a fingernail forming, thinking better of it, and subsiding. The iron straps sweated in their rivet holes and did not notice. Takeshi's face took on the fire's work not as stain, but as borrowing, a wash of copper along the jaw, a brief gleam at the cheekbone that slipped away when Rain insisted. He did not remove his gaze from the meeting place fire to rain, rain to fire, each doing its craft without malice. He remembered another fire under winter pines, Kazuo's hands easing a flame into wetted bark with patience enough to teach. A boy that weather tests character because it offers no praise. He remembered Sayori's line silence will break with blood and felt the unarguable truth that sometimes blood is asked to keep company with smoke before it is asked to answer. Anything else, Nobu's heart thudded as if the drum inside the wall had moved into his chest and learned a new measure. He did not name it fear or awe. He let it be the body's admission that two old things were arguing, wood meant to shut men out and fire meant to refuse the refusal. Sparks rose by dozens, a small swarm of orange insects swept sideways by a gust and then upward again as if the air had decided to give them one more try at the roof. Some died before they could be born. Others landed on soaked boards and gave a hopeful kiss that could not survive. Rain reached its long hands into the work and amended it, not to end it, to dignify it by making it earn everything. Push, a voice said at the second cart's tail. Hold. The words were the width of a breath, as practical and modest. As fingers testing rope, a pole with a hooked iron beak reached high and pulled down a soaked reed mat to make a canopy that did not look like it could help and did. Flame under it found shelter enough to speak more clearly. It took the lower board of the gate and made a long, wet sizzle into a crack. The crack answered by darkening dot from above. A cadre of defenders leaned with careful economy and dropped a row of stones. They were not boulders from stories. They were workmanlike, hand-sized, meant to trouble men, not impress them. They struck. The cart, the ramp, the apron, each thump absorbed by mud. One skittered and kissed the edge of a flame long enough to blush. Another fell into the ditch and disappeared with a round sound the rain ate at once. Defenders sent down a short volley of arrows not lit, their purpose discipline rather than spectacle. They whispered and thudded and stuck into the reed lattice where fire had not yet grown. The men below pulled a woven screen into place, and the arrows taught the screen its new job. Takeshi's hand came to rest on the haft of a nearby pole as if it were a shoulder needing weight. He said nothing. The men near him took the quiet. As instruction, more bundles arrived and were laid carefully, not piled. Each one turned for its best face to the work. Fire does not forgive thoughtlessness when rain is present. The pitch smoked in black breaths and cleared to a cleaner gray as the heat learned how to draw rather than scold. The smell grew thick enough to taste, a resin sweet that turned to iron at the back of the nose. Nobu swallowed it and found. His throat knew how to make space for it, the way it makes space for grief when it refuses to be loud. Gusts pushed smoke low and sideways. For a span, it wrapped the men and the carts and the gate into one anonymous shape in which all labor becomes shared. When it lifted, the world came back in pieces, the glistening strands of rain slipping from the gate's ironwork, the patterned puddle ringing each wheel, the ash smeared on a forearm. A pair of hands passing a torch had first to be driven into a seam where water would struggle to reach. In that brief interval of concealment and revelation, everything seemed to accept its job more quietly. From within, the drum stopped and did not resume. In its place came a different interior sound, lower, longer, the groan of a bar taking counsel with itself, wood remembering a path through wood. It did not lift. It only reminded those listening that a gate is more than doors, then silence again of the humankind. The rain made its own steadfast answer, neither louder nor less. The first part of the gate took flame honestly. The lower, boards, blackened and beaded with water, began to smoke without movement, and then to curl by a finger's width. Flame found the curl and slid under it, made a low, Wet crackle that sounded like a small fire working its way along a line of ink. The crack deepened. Steam lifted in deliberate scrolls, collecting orange at their edges before thinning into the storm. A long blister rose and shivered when a drop struck it and broke like a word unsaid. Another, the leader said behind them, and a third cart rolled, its axle singing once as if pleased to be asked to sing at all. Men under straw coats took the wheels from either side and pressed evenly. Feet dug and gave. A torch bent under rain licked its own handle with a bright tongue and was snuffed by a palm without irritation. The torch returned and tried again, more modest now. Arrows continued to fall. They made a light patter in the reed screen, the occasional wooden knock along the cart's side, the staccato of points striking stone and skipping into puddles. One slid along Nobu's plank like a small fish and fell. Away. He felt the body's old impulse to look for its flight and denied it, letting his eyes remain where he could be of use. A rock tumbled and landed his boot, splashing his shin and leaving the interesting heat of stone that has been held. Near a hearth. He nudged it aside with the soul, not in anger. The fire had grown enough to maintain its own attention. It took the third cart's offering like a priest exacting a ritual from a layman, with patience and the assurance of precedent. The bundles were pushed deeper, and flame entered where rain could not easily reach. Tar showed itself as glossy, then immediately reconsidered and became smoke. The gate's iron straps warmed and shed a line of water faster, as if sweating in embarrassment. Heat reflected from wet stone and returned to the hands that fed it, a shallow warmth that felt like proof rather than comfort. Takeshi's face, lit now by a more persistent glow, revealed the unhelpful information that determination and peace can coexist. The lines beside his mouth did not deepen. His eyes did not narrow against the smoke. His breath did not shorten. He was not calling this fire his. He was witnessing whether it wanted to labor in the rain's house. That distinction traveled outward into the men around him, the way heat moves through a room slow at first. Then present everywhere without having been seen to cross any threshold, Nobu felt awe without wishing. It was not for destruction. It was for the steadiness of many hands accepting the storm's terms. Nothing granted, everything earned. He gripped his sword less to hold it than to keep himself from stepping forward into a place that did not need him yet. The rain washed the edge's mouth clean where a drop found it. The leather tie grew darker and slick. He wanted to speak, avow into the smoke, and decided instead to breathe. The gate tower answered at last with a bucket's answer. A stream of water arced down from above and broke itself on heat, becoming white air that shot outward and then vanished. The men drew back half a step to let the steam have the space it demanded. The fire hissed and ducked, and then, as if embarrassed to have been surprised, found another bed, a handspan to the side. A second bucket followed because men in high rooms preferred to repeat first thoughts before inventing second ones. The buckets were correct, but not enough. Rain had been doing that work for hours and had not much to show. 2 quick insults did not change the character of the exchange. Stones fell again, more thoughtfully. One found the corner of a cart and made it lurch. Hands caught it and answered with balance. One bounced and disappeared into flame with a small scream that was more steam than pain. An arrow bearing cloth alight clung to a seam where oil glistened, and did what it had been meant to do, its small sun flickering in the wet until the seam accepted fire's argument and began to carry it along. It was not triumph. It was instruction received. The smell grew heavier, pitch sharp under pine sweet, char layered with the mineral damp of stone that has met fire reluctantly. Smoke coiled and drifted. Sparks chased their own brief lives upward, turned black mid-flight, and came down as soft pepper. Rain tamped them. Wind herded the smoke toward the ditch and pressed it low, where it crawled along the ground like a thing that had been taught to humble itself. Men coughed once and then learned the rhythm that steals breath and gives it back. Time stretched and narrowed. The work took on the shape of ritual, and the world agreed. Bundles were lifted and offered, tucked and accepted, Flame taking them or refusing and trying again. Torches were fed. A pole reached high and bared a patch of lower board to welcome. Heat where rain had been greedy. Hands blackened by pitch and ash passed along the edges of fire with the care of speakers handing a poem from mouth to mouth. No shouts, no bravado, only the quiet authority of labor in its second hour. Even the defender's noise took on the tone of repetition. Rock, water, arrow. Paused. Takeshi studied the gate as if reading the face of a man who has been insulted and will choose between laughing and drawing steel. There were changes now a lazy eye would miss. A seam that had been tight now breathed. The edge of a board cup-shaped inward. A rivet's halo dried quicker than the rest. Heat began to live there in a way weather cannot assert against. Rock does not learn, wood does. The gate good wood, disciplined, fed with oils for dignity and season-proofing, remembered that its courage had a cost. Nobu lifted his head and, for a simple moment, saw the fire as a creature that could be either companion or judge. The sparks looked like small departures of souls, and he chastised himself for reaching so quickly for symbols. Still, the feeling remained that something larger than this night was being consulted, and that the rain and the fire and the men were answering without quite hearing the questions. He thought of the emblem Takeshi had found in snow, of the feather he had seen in a dream's wet grass, of Sayori's line about storms that do not fall from heaven but rise from men, and felt how all of them seemed to be present inside this. Smoke, a cart emptied and its frame, now a dark silhouette against flame, was eased back along the plank with respectful care. Another took its place. The men had learned how deep into the apron the wheels could go without becoming the apron. Their feet knew where to step. Their hands knew where the rain had made treachery and where it had made help. The reed canopy sagged, spat, and was eased aside to keep from being a lie. Flame adopted like a musician changing key to suit a throat. From the wall, a new sound, careful, as if a decision had been made in a room and given to gravity. A larger stone, not huge, heavy enough to be taken seriously. It fell with dignity and struck short of the carts, forging mud into a brown bloom and sending a cool wave across shins. Men blinked and did not move their hands from their work. The stone lay there, steaming slightly, handsome in its pointlessness. The rain-approved heat deepened. The lower boards of the gate took on a slow, even glow under the black, the way a cloud sometimes admits a sun it cannot bring itself to reveal. The hiss became a crackle and then returned to hiss as a new sheet of rain entered the light and took its wages. Sparks climbed higher. Smoke found the upper eaves, rolled under them, and returned as if it had been refused a seat and did not mind. Takeshi did not smile, did not frown. The glow put a warmth on his cheek that had nothing to do with comfort. He knew the thing men sometimes forget. Fire is most honest when paired with rain. Without rain, fire believes itself a god. With rain, it remembers it is work. He let the thought sit with him the way a small tool is kept in the sleeve until needed. Nobu loosened his grip on the sword and let his hand rest instead on the scabbard's mouth. Feeling the clean line of it with his thumb, he did not plan. He did not hope. He watched the gate accept and resist at once, the very definition of endurance. He felt his heart mark the moments when flame took a fresh breath and when rain stole one back, and in that marking, the fear changed shape, from a beast that wishes to run to a dog that lies down and keeps the door. Another bucket arced from above a better throw and broke hard into a seam, sending steam and sparks outward together. Flame ducked. Men leaned. The bucket fell, bounced once, and landed upright, accepting rain as if humbled by its own futility. A defender called the line neither challenge nor mockery, just men who could not keep the mouth shut in such hours, and the sound went nowhere. Taken by stone and water before it could become sense, the leader moved through the men as a hand moves along a beam, checking for splinters. He settled a bundle a finger's width to its left. He adjusted a torch. He stepped back to see what the fire saw. When his gaze touched Takeshi, he did not ask. Takeshi did not answer. The two accepted that answers would be given later by louder. Teachers stopped in time that felt like the length of a single held breath. The gate's lower boards turned from black to a soft, luminous brown where heat had drunk through wet. A line of sap, long asleep, woke and ran like a weak candle. Drops hung, swelled, fell, met flame, made small stars that winked and disappeared. Rain made their births brief to spare them vanity. Fire took the leftover and carried on thought. Beyond all this noise, there was a stillness with weight. It lay under. The hiss and the crackle, under the bucket's splash, under the drumming of rain. It was the stillness of a room waiting to be entered, of a name about to be spoken, learning how it will sound in the mouth of the day. Men felt it without looking at one another. Nobu felt it as a coolness inside the warm, a blank paper under. A crowded page. Takeshi felt it as the agreement that stands between blade and knot before either acts. The carts gave up their loads one after the other. The last bundles placed where flame could best persuade, not where men wished to see brightness. Smoke climbed heavier now, the coils thick at the base, thinning as they rose, the color of tea left to forget itself on a low hearth. Sparks drifted into the storm wind and were thrown back like messengers told their news was early. The air tasted of resin and iron and something faintly sweet under it, as if old lacquer had been asked to confess. Along the parapet, a lamp moved and held, the way a clerk's hand hovers before giving a word to wood. A chain lifted an inch and set itself down. The drum, having been quiet, tested one note and declined to gather sevens. Rain pressed with new attention and was answered in kind. The gate, taught by men and weather both, continued its lesson at a speed neither found insulting. When the last cart was eased back, men stepped away from the immediate glow and let fire have the space it had earned. They stood in the rain and watched the orange live in the gate's low seam, not celebrating, not despairing. It was not victory or failure. It was a door being asked to consider a different use. Steam rose and lit the undersides of drops. Smoke drew thin and kept its line. Sparks rode up and went out like modest appointments kept without witnesses. Takeshi's face held the fire as long as it needed, and then let it go. As a teacher releases a student to an exam none can take for him. His hand remained near the knot, easy, available, unhurried. The glow gave him an older look for a moment and then returned it. The rain washed his cheek in a single line that might have been sweat in another season. He did not move dot and obey, you breathed in the change, and felt his heart answer not with pounding now, but with a measured beat. A man uses when he carries water from a well over uneven ground, careful, regular, committed to arriving with most of it still in the bucket. He found himself standing a degree taller without deciding to. He watched flame press, watched rain stiffen in its reply, and recognized in that exchange the way men speak when no one is allowed to be wrong yet. The cries of men few. Functional rose and fell at the edges, moved away as tasks ended, returned when new ones began. Their texture was grain, not wave. They did not add to the hour, they acknowledged it. Arrows still came, but sparsely now, concerned with duty rather than appetite. Stones had exhausted their brief rhetoric. Buckets, those small sermons of water, arrived and were heard and were set down in the mud to accept rain with humility. Smoke made a slow canopy over the apron, a ceiling the storm pressed, lower and then allowed to rise by fingers. The pitch smell sharpened where heat found a deeper seam. The rain smell deepened where water found new paths. Between the two, the night learned a new odor that would cling to hair and cloth until morning, unmistakable, untranslatable, the scent of determination, meeting resistance, and deciding to take another breath. Beneath it all, the stillness thickened, refined by the work rather than frayed by it. Destiny was not loud here. It waited like a person seated in a dark room who has chosen his chair and will not move until the door opens. Men sensed it and kept their words small. Fire grew where it could, steady as a vow. Rain pressed its palm without anger. The gate. Listen. Takeshi did not draw his blade. He had never intended to. This was not Steel's hour. He let the glow hold his profile, light finding the wet fringe of the hat, the straight set of the mouth, the patient angle of a jaw that belonged, first to work and only later to war. Nobu stood beside him with both hands on the scabbard now, not to restrain the sword, but to study, himself in the clean presence of what must be done. The night went on making its music, the crackle and hiss of wet fire against soaked gates. The rain's long applause, the occasional stone's dull syllable, a bucket's brief hymn, the low voices of men, the quiet of the fortress between breaths. Sparks wandered up like small, stubborn prayers that did not ask to be heard. Smoke drifted, then returned, the script of a story the storm would keep for itself. The gate, warming into its resistance, gave back a faint, hungry glow that did not brag, and under that glow a strange stillness sat larger than fear, smaller than triumph, something like acceptance, something like a hand poised above a seal. The cart stood empty, the men stood listening, the rain worked, the fire worked, the walls thought, the drums withheld their grammar. Takeshi in his quiet, Nobu in his awe, the Ronin in their labor, all held steady in the charged pause before. Answers, the fortress did not yield. It did not refuse. It took fire as one takes a visitor who has come in weather and will be offered tea before questions. The night drew its breath deeper. Fate did not speak. It waited, and the fire at the gate burned with the patience of inevitability, as if the world, for a long moment, were nothing but rain falling, wood answering, and men standing to hear what the next hour would decide. The gate burned without triumph. Flame kept its low labor, folding in on wet wood, breathing out steam that became sheets of pale air, then vanished into rain. Pitch hissed and learned humility. Smoke rode a dark ceiling and let the storm press it down by slow degrees. The world narrowed to orange and black and the plain gray of water running. Men stood at a practiced distance and listened to the fire's patient speech. The fortress withheld its reply. It had learned to let wood and weather argue in private. Wind gathered from the east like a forgotten thought returning. It tugged at the limp banners above the parapet, found a little authority, and drew them once across the stone, as if testing whether cloth remembered how to be a sign. Rain slapped the wall in a harder pattern, larger drops arriving with the sound of small pebbles, spattering and running in quick rivulets along the ironwork, pooling on the protruding lips of brackets before spilling in steady strings. The drum within the tower tried a single note and chose silence again, as if reminded that not all hours belonged to counting. Nobu stood with both hands resting on the scabbard's mouth, knuckles wet and pale. Heat from the gate brushed his face in thin pulses that never became warmth. Smoke found his eyes and asked them to sting. He refused by blinking and letting tears be rain. The beat in his throat was not the drum, but something more personal. A small hammer that made his breath brief and obedient. He kept to Takeshi's left, a half step back, the place where he could see the gate, the wall, the line of men, could see everything he was ready to see. Lightning had been rare tonight. a pale flicker behind cloud that made the sky look like paper held to a lamp. Now a seam opened within that mass, and light came, a thin blade that cut through rain without sound, ran along the parapet, and found a figure not there a breath ago, or else unseen for having been part of the wall. He stood above the burning gate, between two arrow slits dark as patient eyes. Black armor took firelight like a memory polished where wet made it rich, dulled where soot had stroked it. Plates overlapped in a pattern that knew how to bear weight. Lemele kitted together with cords that looked newer than the storm wanted. To admit, the menpo hid the lower half of his face, iron shaped into a demon's mouth, teeth and grimace carved with the quiet pride of someone who expects night to do the exaggeration for him. Its surface gleamed when lightning found it and became cool again when rain owned the next breath. Above it, the eyes were shadow, not because they were empty, but because the fire below and the cloud above conspired to keep them. Meaning without detail, wind pulled at the banners just then and gave them form. The cloth woke and leaned, and the crest stitched there, Kensei's, stubborn ink refusing even this much rain, seemed to nod without consent. The figure did not move with them. He was weight, not weather. His stillness changed the clearing the way a loaded cart changes a road. Nothing appears different, and yet everything carries new burden. A hush traveled outward, not abrupt, not theatrical, simply present, like a tide correcting itself. Men felt their mouths close and their shoulders lower by a finger's width. Words that had been ready to rise about buckets and bundles stayed behind the teeth. The fire itself seemed to take a slower breath, its crackle becoming finer, its hiss more exact, as if the presence above had made the elements choose diction. Takeshi's silence deepened, not by becoming larger, but by becoming a room within a room. Under the brim of his straw hat, his gaze fixed where lightning had painted iron into a face too quickly to memorize. He did not search for meaning in the demon's sneer. Masks do not promise honesty. He searched for something else, the line of the shoulders, the set of weight through the hips, the angle of a head when it listens to rain instead of to men. And in those plain mechanics, he felt the old, stubborn tug of familiarity, as if the unseen brush of a hand had drawn his attention. Years ago, to a posture in another yard, a stance at the edge of a river, the economy of someone who understood the cost of standing where others display. The general did not raise his arm, did not point, did not make the gates labor his own with a gesture. He simply stood. Firelight rose and washed his armor in copper, slid along wet ridges, and lost itself in black seams. His men behind the embrasures had already learned that arrows are less persuasive in rain. None loose now. The sound the wall offered was wind through slits and water talking down stone. The small, exact noises of a place that has nothing to add to an introduction. Nobu's breath went lighter, small and quick, as if the body wished to hide its presence. From eyes that could not possibly find him, he felt fascination and fear take their seats side by side without quarrel. The mask, the demon mouth with iron teeth, did what such mouths are meant to do. It gave shape to a man's decision to be greater than himself by becoming less legible. But what fixed the boy was not the darkness of the mouth. It was the unmoving way the figure held space. How everything around him seemed to act more honestly for being observed by something that did not declare itself. Nobu realized with a small shame and a larger relief that he had been waiting for this shape to appear without knowing it. A longer lightning ripped the roof of cloud and left night behind for a counting's breadth. The general's armor came into detail, the cross-knotted cords dark with water, the slight pattern etched along the overlapping plates like reeds pressed into clay. The menpo's cheek carved with a scar no artisan would add without reason. The brow above, just visible beneath a warhood's rim, seemed calm in the wick of brightness. A charm or a knot hung at the throat, not ornament, function disguised as faith. Then dark again, the image burned into eyes that would rewrite it. In the mind until truth and invention became one line. Below, the gate answered its own work with a soft crack. A lower board, long reluctant, admitted heat in a clean seam. Flame found it and spoke there in a tone even the rain respected. Steam railed in a sheet and lifted toward the parapet, wrapped the general's legs for a breath, and thinned, so that he appeared to stand on cloud drawn from the fire. The demon mouth glowed a dull cherry, and the lips curve where firelight found it and rain refused it, a small, false life. He did not acknowledge it by any adjustment or disdain. The hush among the Ronin became almost formal. Men who had been setting bundles paused and left them in exactly the right places without the slight adjustments ordinary hands insist upon. A torch was pinched and offered forward as if carried into a shrine. The leader moved along the edge of the work with the dignity of one who knows his own noise is not needed and is grateful. Even the crow that had taken to circling this arena of human significance chose a farther perch, as if the mask's blank sneer had reminded it that omens require distance. Rain slashed with new authority for a stretch, driven sideways by a pettier wind. It clattered along the rims of helmets and made 100 small notes on the cart's frames. It struck the stone of the wall with the unmusical satisfaction of an element confident of outlasting whatever humans write on it. The banners went mad and then tired again. Through this, the general kept his position. He did not test the rope of thunder for cover, did not seize the lightning's brightness for timing. His abstention made even the restraint of those below feel like action. Takeshi's memory moved without leave. He saw a courtyard long ago where men trained to the count of a master who never raised his voice. He saw Kazuo at the far edge, correcting the angle of his own wrist because small things do not wait for praise. He saw another, the Captain Matsuda, perhaps standing as this figure stood now, translating weather into instruction by doing nothing. The thought stung and soothed. Belonging is not ownership. The way this man placed himself above fire and rain said he belonged to the fortress, or to the idea fortress believes in, the way a tree belongs to a hill. The familiarity was not person, it was practice. And yet, under that clear reasoning, fate polished a small stone of recognition with a thumb. From the wall's nearer corner, a lantern was set down and left. Its flame under glass became a steady witness, showing that the general's stillness was not the artifact of lightning but his craft. The glass beaded up with rain and made his shape a little softer, as if the fortress had found its own way to see him as a symbol rather than a man. Nobu bit down on the impulse to find a name. Naming too quickly is a form of fear. The demon mouth, when firelight threw it a favor, showed the faintest lift at one corner, not a smile. Not speech, only the effect of hammered iron in time. A drop ran along the curve and fell, a bright bead in flame's gift that became ordinary water again halfway to the parapet's lip. The eyes above remained depth, not light. Nobu thought of old stories told under roofs and winter shadows entering rooms. Masks speaking judgments, gates recognizing men by the weight of their footsteps. Those stories had always seemed too large for any field he might walk. Tonight they had come down to the size of rain on stone. A defender, perhaps unable to bear how the moment made him small, hurled a stone, and it spun in a short arc that promised harm but kept only physics. It struck the apron with an embarrassed thud and became a dark, wet egg in the mud. No one laughed. The wall seemed to tighten around the general like a belt. The men below drew a half-breath together and let it out without signal. The fire, sensing a different audience, climbed the curl of a board with more purpose, and the seam answered with a sound like a thin string being tuned. One more lightning, longer than the rest, louder in its silence, walked the length of the parapet, and held for count 1, 2, 3 before letting dark return. In that pause, the demon face became absolute, the iron teeth white for a breath, the jawline cruel because weather exaggerates what men forge. The black plates of armor drank the light and gave back the exact amount needed to be seen. The cords went slick and orderly, each knot true. A small, rectangular charm at the throat showed kanji too quick to read and too personal to warrant public interpretation. Nobu's heart forgot itself for that count and returned with a thread of pain like a stitch. The hush took on a new quality expectation with nowhere to go. The stillness felt like the air in a room where a verdict waits behind a sliding door. Men shifted weight with the reverence of those who understand that noise is not always accompaniment, that sometimes interference. The storm was loud, yet below that loudness prowled a quiet that did not belong to weather. It belonged to choice. Takeshi tasted pitch, then the cleaner smell of soaked cedar from the gate, then the iron breath of rain on stone, all of it familiar, all of it honest. He let the Mempo's lair be what it was, a decision to remove the human mouth from the hour. That left bearing. In bearing, he read discipline that would not yield to anger, a fatigue older than this season. The practiced cruelty of someone who has learned to do harm without changing his pulse. Pride was not there, or was there in the negative pride so practiced it became absence. This he recognized. He had learned to fear it without hating it. A sigh of wind slid under the eaves and pulled smoke sideways. For a moment, the general silhouette broke into pieces, shoulder, head, torso, and then rejoined as smoke let go. The illusion made him more phantom than man, a figure that could be folded and unfolded by weather. Nobu shivered, not from cold. He had seen many men since the road began, bandits with loud weapons and louder hunger, farmers with quiet spines, soldiers with ropes instead of thoughts. He had not seen this, a person who could make everyone else's purpose sit still. Leader of the Ronin reached Takeshi's side and did not pretend to ignore what stood above. He set his palm against the cart's frame and left it there, a simple act anchoring him to earth. His beard wept rain. His eyes weighed the wall, then the fire, then the man. His jaw tightened once because the body recognizes weight before the mind grants words. He said nothing that would steal the moment from itself. Above, the general finally altered something. His head turned a degree. The interpretation of that measured by the fact that the mask's crooked grin shifted its attention. Was he looking toward the river? Toward the ford that had muttered to itself all night? Toward the line of men who had not yet drawn steel? The knowledge did not fall with the drop that left the Mempo's lip. Takeshi felt the turn inside his own neck and allowed it to be mirrored without meaning surrender. Two rooms had met eyes. Through rain, the drum spoke again at last, not a call. A statement, one low syllable that found the stone, enlarged, and settled into the ground under everyone's feet. A chain lifted somewhere behind the gate and set itself down like a thought postponed. Buckets hauled to the parapet were abandoned at arm's reach and left to collect weather. The men along the wall did not look at their leader. They already understood that in his presence, even obedience should be quiet. Nobu's breath shortened until it had to be helped. He reminded himself to let air in and out and did, and found that the effort steadied his hearing. He heard in detail, rain slapping stone, wind combing banner, fire's long hiss where a board's inner sap met heat and resigned, water pouring from a scupper like a small river, the soft spit of pitch taking, a boot setting into mud with respect. These were the sounds that would remain after the mask's face left his eye. He gathered them as a shield against what story might try to claim this hour later. Takeshi stood. If his heart changed, no one could swear to it. The recognition he felt did not claim a name. It claimed a path, a narrow one, worn into the earth by two pairs of feet walking toward each other over years that did not know they were seasons in the same field. He allowed that knowledge to be heavy and not urgent. Fate, if such a thing travels with men, had chosen to watch tonight with its hands folded. It would not interrupt. Lightning came once more, not over long, just enough to let the iron teeth glow and the black armor shine like wet shale. The general's presence filled the parapet so completely that the wall spaces looked like script around him. Rain curled under the brim of his war hood and ran along the plates like 1,000 unremarked decisions. The banners behind him tugged against their ties in small, domestic rebellions that made the stone smile without changing. The demon mouth, caught in the brief white, seemed to ask a question whose answer could only be written in time. Beneath, flame made a gentle, insistent noise against the gate, a choir of small voices insisting on their line. Buckets and stones and arrows had receded, unwilling to jostle this new center. The Ronin waited, some with heads slightly bowed, some with eyes lifted without impertinence, some with hands on tools still working because work maintains courage when symbols threaten to steal it. The field between wall and ditch held, water and panes that shook with each gust and returned to glass, catching orange and gray in equal measure. The general did not leave. He existed until existence itself felt like a kind of verdict. The moment stretched and thickened, not to punish, to inform. Men learned the precise measure of their breath. Rain relearned stone, fire relearned water, and under all of it, a quiet with teeth set down rootstock when finally the lightning went and did not return, when firelight alone was left to underline. Iron and shadow, Nobu lowered his eyes because he could not keep them up respectfully any longer. He exhaled and tasted ash and rain together, a sacrament that asked for no oath. Takeshi remained, gaze lifted but not fixed, seeing not only the mask but what must walk under it and what awaited him beside and behind it. Rooms of decision, halls of paper, a space where a man takes off iron and becomes accountable to his own face again. The wind pulled once more at the banners and then calmed, as if satisfied that they would not be invited to speak. The drum tried another solitary word and decided not to continue. The gate burned in its low, steady way, a task unglamorous and relentless. The storm kept its scrupulous balance. Above it all, the phantom general watched, a shadow with weight, a mouth of iron, a stillness that placed a hand on the neck of the hour. No duel began. None was needed. The confrontation lived without touching, and those below understood that a name had entered the siege and would not leave by any door men could open. That rain fell. Fire answered. Stone listened. Men stood. And in the long pause between a lightning that has passed and another that may not come, destiny sat with its back straight and its eyes open, attending the way a master attends a lesson he has given 100 times and knows one student will hear differently tonight. Dawn did not arrive so much as reveal its intention. The sky paled behind rain, a grayness taking the place of night without ceremony. Smoke from the night's labor drifted low and thin, content now to be only smell and memory. The field before, the fortress, was a mirror for cloud, pocked by footprints, scored by wheel ruts where carts had come and gone like slow thoughts. The gate tower shed water from its eaves in 4 steady curtains. The doors dark with pitch and the work of flame steamed where embers had licked and been refused. The air carried the honest reek of soaked wood and burned resin, the faint iron breath of wet nails and strap work, the sour trace of tar. Rain tapped every surface with the patience of someone counting to the end of a long ledger. Men gathered to the left of the ditch around a shape that had slept under mats through the storm. They stripped back the woven cover and the morning took. In the ram, it was an oak trunk iron-capped, the head ringed with riveted bands, whose rivets stood like dull eyes. Rope slings hung from a brace frame. The ropes were fat with rain, dark and compliant. The frame itself was low, its legs splayed like a careful animal's, wed to a pair of wheel blocks to steady its fury into ritual. Hands tested lashings, shook a pin, leaned their weight to see whether the wood remembered the night's agreement. It did not. No voice called for courage. The hour was already loud with inevitability. A low order went out like a breath, lift and shoulders took. The ropes. The ram moved half roll, half sway, then settled with the deep and satisfied weight of something asked to be exactly what it was made to be. Mud received the first steps with its small, faithful suction. Men adjusted grip by finger widths. One touched the iron head with open palm as a man brushes the forehead of an ox before putting it to the plow. A torch, coaxed back from sulk to ember beneath a hood, breathed a little orange into the rain and then hit its pride dot. Takeshi stood, a pace ahead of the frame as it set itself for the first run. The brim of his straw hat dripped in a neat chain at its rim, rhythmic as the morning's pulse. Smoke had left a faint stain along his sleeve that the rain did not bother to chase. He looked at the gate without wishing it to be weaker than it was. He had learned to mistrust wishes. He held the silence in front of him as if it were a bowl, not empty but waiting. Nobu took his place to the left, half step back, fingers firm at the scabbard's mouth. His hands trembled as they had in storms before, the trembling now acquainted with the work and less inclined to shame him for it. The smell of wet wood and hot pitch made a bitter sleep in his throat. He accepted it. He watched the ram's iron, head nod and swing, and thought of a temple bell he had seen as a child, how the rope had brought the beam to the bell's lip, how sound had come slow and round and large, how the air had become a room. He did not say a prayer. He did not know whether the gate would listen. Ready, said the leader, voice unhurried, and the men holding the slings bent their knees together, as if settling before a bow is drawn. Rain thickened its handwriting. A crow lifted off the parapet and chose a farther perch as if mindful of the sentence about to be spoken. Inside the wall, somewhere beyond timber and stone, a chain jostled and quieted, the house shifting on its own breath. Then, with a long inhalation shared by many backs, the ram drew away, swung, and came on. The first strike was not noise. It was place. Iron kissed timber, and the sound entered the door. Then the beam behind the door, then the wall around both. Then the 1,000 small cavities in stone that make room for weather. Then the valley that had waited all night to hear it. It spread with a measured dignity and returned, less sound now than condition. The doors shuddered and shed water and splinters both. A black line at the join shook itself awake and closed again like a mouth in sleep. The men in the slings absorbed the recoil with knees and backs that had been taut, and the ram hung for a breath in satisfied surprise, then settled. Rain rode on it and was ignored. A second run. The ropes sang a low, wet note. The iron head swung higher, met wood with a deeper tone, and the echo went out farther, up through the tower and along the parapets where watchmen stood with their palms on stone to feel what words cannot give. Mud leapt in small crowns around. The wheels. Splinters flew, some thin and pale, landing like rain reversed. Some dark, pitch-slick, bitten off as if by teeth, and thrown into the pools at the apron's base. The smell under the rain quickened, the sweet char of wood pushed toward coal, the animal fat of old bindings sacrificed in jest by the night, the tar's stubborn perfume refusing to be outlived. The valley learned the beat. Each boom arrived, like a heart deciding on a larger body. Pines on the slope answered by shedding a rattle of drops. The river out of sight found a tone to carry it. Even the crows measured their remarks to it and then gave up the point. Within the fortress, Rooms, paper on walls trembled in its own hum. A tea bowl on a low table tremored a breath and refused to show the ripple. The bar behind the gate old. Faithful took the message and returned one. A groan long and thoughtful, not complaint, consideration dot between strikes. Men breathed as a choir does when it has found its note. The ram drew back, came forward. Back forward. Shoulders changed hands without call. One man's simple life took another's place for 3 swings and then stepped aside. The frame creaked, not in protest, in the intimate language wood uses with itself. A sling spat water. Rope fibers swelled. Rain traced the iron head until the next kiss rubbed the line away. Takeshi stepped with the rhythm, one small advance each time the ram returned to its cradle, never in the moment of noise, always on the breath afterward. His boots learned the shallow valleys of water without looking. He avoided the splinters scatter without robbing the splinters of their dignity. He did not hurry the hour. He did not lend his breath to the sound. He carried forward a stillness that fit inside the strike and did not break. Nobu struggled with the distance between awe and fear, moving as a man walks a narrow sill in rain. The boom thudded into his chest and made his fingers tighten on the scabbard until the leather tie complained. Each time splinters flew, his eye followed them like poor stars. Each time the gate shivered, he felt the animal inside him ready to run forward and strike at it as if insult could wear wood. He kept pace by watching Takeshi's shoulders, by counting quietly, not numbers, not words, only the interval that tethers a man to himself. Again, the leader said, as if the command could ever be otherwise. The ram returned, then swung, and the third strike found a patient seam that the night's flame had begun. The door answered with a change in tone too honest to hide, a throat forgetting how to make the lie. The crack opened by the width of a reed, spitting a fret of pale wood tufts and a wet cough of smoke that was not quite smoke anymore, water. Ran into it and out of it in a little loop that served no one but physics. The bar behind groaned again, a deeper, older sound, the voice of a tree laid on its side long ago, remembering wind. Inside the wall, figures gathered in the shadow lengths, armor with water falling from the lamellae and fine chains, sleeves. Tightened to the last hole, bows held low to keep their strings clean of the gate's splash. They were silhouettes at a slant, their edges softened by steam and rain. Their mouths moved without sound, reaching outward. Their gear spoke for them buckles. Brief talk, the wet brush of cloth against cloth. Somewhere above, a lamp skated along a parapet and held its place as if words would be written there. The ram withdrew and struck again. Boom. Splinters went farther. A strip of pitch ran like a tear and left a glossy track. The iron head found. The same place because the hands on the ropes had learned what the gate had taught them. The frame shivered, steadied. The men in the slings set their feet wider. Rain applauded lightly as if to keep time, and a gust came across the field and pressed coats against backs, hats against hair, banners against poles, everything saying yes to the hour. The sound traveled through Takeshi cleanly now, the way a voice passes through someone who has accepted what is being said. He felt the memory of an inner door Kazuo's voice speaking low in a winter hall, the way his hand had paused over a seal he did not yet press. He felt Sayori's sentence, not as omen now, but as weather. Silence will break with blood. He did not hurry toward that breaking. He did not hold it back. He understood the ram as both staff and bow, a blunt instrument making a path to horses that wished to walk. Nobu's breath shortened on one strike, and he commanded it to lengthen. On the next, he smelled burning pitch marry with rain and make a new odor that seemed to cling to thought as much as to cloth. He tasted ash without swallowing any. The splinters flew and a few struck his shin. He ignored the sting because weather has a similar hand. He wanted to speak Takeshi's name, and the desire taught him better names spoken now are questions. Better to hold them behind the teeth as answers ripen. Hold, said the leader, and the ram hung, heavy in its ropes, trembling with its last decision. Men shook their arms out once, the traditional offering to joints, and set themselves again. Forward. The head came like a planet in patient orbit, and the gate took it, and the valley took the sound, and the fortress received its own echo. The doors moved, no longer shiver, but shift an inward concession measured in a child's thumb. The crack widened. Wet wood flexed and forgot how to return entirely to itself. The bar behind asked to be more than bar, refused by groaning like an elder who has already said no as many times as dignity permits. Its brackets felt the complaint and considered sending it to the wall. The wall did not want it. The groan. Lived in the wood and died, a lesson learned. Rain made its own work finer. It sought every new edge of broken fiber and brimmed it with beads that magnified the pale colors underneath. These beads shook with the next strike and leapt, flashed, fell, vanished in the brown mirror of the apron's shallow water. The ram's iron cap bore rain like a crown of nothing. Rope leaked drops from every twist and knot, sheeted from the gullies of the slings in quiet. Waterfalls that would have been beautiful if the hour had allowed such a word. Takeshi stepped again. He did not draw the blade. He had carried its wakefulness all night and now carried it a little closer to the gate, as a man brings a lighted wick toward a candle's cold string without touching the two. Nobu came with him, heart bucking in. The trace is like a horse that respects its harness but does not love it. The boy's hands tightened until they ceased to tremble and began instead to hold. Again, said the leader, and the ram obeyed. Boom. The doors took the boom and returned. A crack that sounded like a river splitting ice, not shattering, separating. A pale line showed at the join like the first lifting of dawn under shutters. Steam rose in a sheet and then fell back as if shy of the air beyond. Inside, a figure moved into the new light and became only outline again. The men in the slings changed places without breaking the song. A hand from the rear took a rope from a hand that had done its share, and the hand that released the rope went to another task without claiming to be noble. Shoulders slipped beneath cords that had the honesty to leave marks. One man rolled his neck and smiled to himself, not for joy, but for the precise pleasure of work done correctly. Takeshi watched the crack, not greedily. He knew thresholds do not like to be stared at. He watched the boards deliver their groans and then recover, watched the iron straps gather water and then shed it in ribbons, watched the hinge pins at the outer edges keep their secrets. He felt behind him the line of Ronin making themselves. Ready not for charge, but for walking. Running is loud. Walking is decision. He preferred the latter. Nobu's mind tried to leap ahead to imagine the courtyard beyond. The stair, the shadowed rooms, the man in the demon mask, and he brought it back by naming what he could smell. Wet wood, pitch, leather, smoke, rain. He named what he could hear. Boom, groan, hiss, breath. He named what he could feel. The scabbard's mouth under his thumb, the small flex of the shoulders around him, the mud accepting his weight and releasing it. The naming tied him to the hour the way a knot keeps a boat from wandering. The ram drew back once more, slow as respect, and then swung with all that respect turned to purpose. The iron head found its seam like a pilgrim finds the shrine he knew. Without a map, the strike went through. The crack leaped. The bar behind cried out, a sound that was half wood torn, half promise breaking. The left door shuddered and withdrew a finger's breadth. Then, too, the red half of that, their inner edges no longer true. Splinters burst outward in a brief hail and pattered into the water at the base. Rain took the dust the wood made and kneaded it into the mud as if to say, all returns. A breath lived in the line of men an intake both relief and brace. No cheer rose. The ram did not stop to be congratulated. It swung again, now into a door already considering surrender. The boom had a different shape, less valley, more room. The seam surrendered to unevenness, a laugh with no humor, and the inside air came out, colder, carrying the chalky smell of stone kept dry, the faint tang of ink, the unslept fatigue of men standing in shadow. Smoke from the night's fire under. The gate curled in and made itself at home there with a politeness no one had invited. Forward, the leader said, this time not to the ram, but to the line. They moved. Not as a surge, as a tide decided upon hours ago. Feet lifted and set, lifted and set. The ram struck again behind them, a benediction after the sermon. The left door creaked inward another hand's width, and one hinge sang a note that had waited 30 years for this morning to be in tune. The right answered with a lower voice. The gap was no longer a line. It was a narrow door. Inside the door, Takeshi walked. Rain ran from the hat's rim and met the seam's steam. He felt his breath lengthen without command, the body making room. For a house it had not entered and had already accepted. Nobu kept pace, heartbeat quick, steps careful, hands fixed to their vow. The smell changed with each pace, a little less field, a little more room. Less pitch, more cedar and ink. Less storm, more thought dot at the threshold. The world grew quieter, not outside, but inside men. The battering behind them continued its appointed conversation with wood, now nearer to conclusion than beginning. The ronin at their shoulders widened, to let those with tools of door work go first. A shield came up, not aloft, simply forward to receive what the gap wished to send. No one pushed. All leaned dot beyond. Under the tower's low belly, defenders filled the air as shadows stood by, occupying what light gives them without taking it. Spears tilted, thinking of angles. Thous stayed low in the wet. A few helmets nodded once as if greeting the morning's claim on them. No challenge came. The house, having been asked a question with iron and storm all night, had chosen for the moment to keep its words for its inner rooms. The ram's last necessary stroke sounded like a decision written down. The left door stuttered inward enough to let 3 men pass abreast, none of them proud about it. The right, in seeing its partner choose, consented to forget symmetry. The bar behind, relieved of duty by force and by its own age, settled into a place where it could be broken into craft later stools for a kitchen, perhaps, or rails for a stable some second life not yet granted. The breach was not triumph. It was a space, air met air, wet met dry, night met room. Rain reached into shade and became a different water. Steam drifted upward in one long curtain and put itself away in the tower's timber. The smell of wet wood and burning pitch lingered. In the joint a border of scents marking other borders. Men paused a half step, just enough to let the hour write itself on them and not be smudged by hurried. Takeshi stood at the lip. He did not draw. He lifted his eyes to the dimness under the beam and let them travel along the curve of stone, the dark of slot and stair, the edge where the tower's belly met the yard beyond. He felt the line of the blade at his side like a sentence that will be spoken only when the room is ready to hear it. Nobu, a breath behind, tightened his grip until his fingers ached and then eased them, ashamed of the ache and comforted by it. He listened as if listening could teach him how to step. Behind, the ram rested in its ropes like a bell asked to keep silent after a funeral. Its iron head dripped thick drops that struck puddles with the sound of a day spent telling the truth. The men who had carried it let the ropes fall away from their shoulders and stood with their hands open to the rain, as if washing them in the morning that remained. No one patted backs. The work had been enough to name them. Inside the breach, the shadows gathered into clearer shapes. A line shifted deeper into the yard. A figure on the gallery above leaned slightly, and the demon's iron mouth appeared at the parapet's throat as if it had been waiting not to enter, only to observe. The line men cross when patience is spent. Nobu saw nothing more than a suggestion and felt enough. The valley held the echo of the last strike, its edges softening, being taken up by grass and pine and river, until it was no longer a sound, but a condition one might call mourning. Rain went on with its even hand. The banners above the wall stirred only when wind asked softly. A crow shook itself and made the old sound one makes when a story reaches its first page. Takeshi stepped forward, and the threshold took his weight without comment. He became smaller in the space under the tower and somehow larger also, as if the room could not decide which of his truths it wished to keep. Nobu followed, and the breath he drew seemed to come from another kind of air, one that had been counted and judged by walls for years. Behind them, men moved in a measured line, spearheads low, shields honest, eyes taught by rain to be patient with what they could not see. The silence that received them was not empty. It was held. The defenders did not roar. The Ronin did not cheer. The gate, having learned enough from fire and iron, ceased to lecture and listened with the rest. The deep boom had done its work and retired. In its place stood the slower pulse of feet, the ritual of crossing from weather into decision. The breach was made. The border between waiting and destiny had been drawn by iron and widened by wood's tired consent. On either side of that border, men breathed and did not yet spend their breath on noise. Smoke curled into the higher places like a thought given time. Rain threaded into the yard and met stone that had not expected it. The true battle waited in the quiet with its hands folded. Polite and exact, a guest invited and not yet seated. The gate's wounded mouth stood open to the rain. Dawn had taken the color from the world and left it in grays. Stone washed a shade lighter, timber blackened to a patient gloss, puddles holding a dim sky like bowls that would not spill. Smoke moved through the breach in layered veils, first low and thick, then torn by a gust into threads that drifted across the courtyard and rejoined as if remembering themselves. The smell was the hour's true grammar, wet wood tiring into ash, pitch turning bitter, old cedar surrendering its sweetness to heat. Iron's faint tang lifted by rain. Takeshi stepped under the beam and into the fortress yard as a man enters weather he has already accepted. He did not hurry his feet. His solace found the small rises in packed earth, the shallow rills where water chose to run, the nail head set in plank that linked yard to hall. Every step measured, neither apologizing nor claiming. The brim of his hat drew quiet lines of water that fell to his coat and disappeared. The sword at his side rode easily, unchanged by the gate's impatience. The knot remembered what knots remember and asked for nothing. Nobu followed close, a pace back and left, the distance they had learned without a word. Smoke took his outline and softened it until he looked like a figure drawn with ink that had been blown upon before it could dry. The boy's breath came short at first, the body's correction for air gone thick, and then lengthened as he found the rhythm the fortress had forced upon the morning. He felt the scabbard's mouth beneath, his thumb, the leather's wet edge cooling his skin. He felt the urge to wipe ash from his cheek and let it remain, as if this were the place to wear the world lightly rather than wipe it away. Beyond them, the Ronin widened the breach with their presence. Shields came forward and built a low wall of moving wood. Spears leaned into the yard with their heads down as though listening. Men passed in pairs, then threes. The mutter of orders stayed near the ground, a language spoken to mud and stone rather than to pride. Farther in, the fortress answered with the sounds of a house correcting itself. A door slammed against a hook and released. A chain lifted and set down. The hollow footfall of men crossing a gallery above a courtyard that did not yet belong to anyone. Takeshi took the first corridor to the left. It ran beneath a gallery and along a strip of garden where rain had gathered in a stone basin now filled with ash. Bamboo leaned and repaid the wind its debt, one leaf at a time. Smoke curled along the eaves, coiling and separating, making figures, with their backs to the world that dissolved when looked at. In those dissolving shapes, something entered the room of his attention, not a voice exactly, not a word, but an intention that traveled like breath across the surface of water dotted. Began where the crackle lived. When flame found a tatami edge and worried it, when a plank spat and laid down, when a smoldering reed made the small, neat sound of itself becoming less, the sound carried a second thread, a faint contour of meaning, barely there, the way a memory shows the grain of a table beneath the cloth someone has set on it. Takeshi did not raise his head to seek it. He let it arrive as a smell arrives. Asked nothing of it, but it be true. Under the smoke, under the rain and the muffled clash of men meeting at the foot of a stair they could not agree about, under the scuff of boots and the reed whistle of an arrow serving its obligation to physics, he heard what he had not written down and had not dared to name. It was not Kazuo speaking the way the living speak through throat and mouth, with breath that warms the air. It was the memory of his brother's weight in a room, the way a hall becomes different when a certain pair of shoulders occupies it, the way a hand hovers before correcting a stance, the way quiet in his presence learned to do more work. Thread of it leaned close to his ear from no particular direction and shaped the simplest admonition. Not here. He changed nothing to show he had heard. He only gave his next step to the right-hand side of the corridor, where the floor's boards ran sounder and the view ahead opened a degree sooner to the inner yard. Nobu, seeing nothing altered besides the angle of a shoulder, matched him. A low doorway gave into a store of spear shafts and mats. The mats hissed in their sleep as droplets found them through a burnt hole above. The shafts lay in their racks, patient as winter bamboo, the varnish lifted to a gray by heat that had kept its promises too long. Across the way, a sliding panel had been shoved aside and warped so that it would not close again. Smoke braided through the new gap and learned the architecture the way a cat learns a house by night, by edges, by corners, by the pressure it takes to turn without touching. The clashes elsewhere had found their muffling now, as though someone had thickened the air between men with cloth. When steel met wood, it did so with a conductor's restraint. When a voice rose, it was close and then gone again, refusing to carry. The fortress itself was the listener. It held all of it and offered none of it back. Takeshi walked through that listening as into a shrine before the candles are lit. Whisper returned where a charred lintel still bled a slow blackness. It came not as sound, but as the memory of a gesture. A palm turned out, weight, and a chin's near invisible tilt toward the right, this way. He followed the tilt through. A narrow passage between a granary door blown inward by heat and a wall whose plaster had sloughed in a slow, hushed avalanche. The floor there had taken water and held it shallow. His sandals printed and lifted, each print filled at once, each lift remarked by a soft release. The quietest applause. Nobu's silhouette wavered in the reflection at his feet. Here, where smoke knitted more thickly, the boy's face became eyes and a wet line at the mouth. The rest turned to smudged charcoal. Takeshi looked once to be sure the hands were steady. They were. The knuckles were pale under soot, but the fingers curved with discipline rather than panic. That was enough. They came to the first inner yard. Rain had entered and set its insistence down among stones placed long ago, with the belief that weather could be instructed but not commanded. A maple raised a few leaves blackened at their rims. Pond water received ash without complaint. A carp rolled near the surface and left a round that carried smoke and rain toward a dead hydrangea head. Prayer slips hung under the gallery and flacked with a whisper that no human mouth should try to imitate. Ink bled down their fibers in slow tears. and words that had been delicately sure of themselves learned humility, becoming lines, becoming so much wet paper. Above, a lantern swung from a beam whose char had stopped short of catastrophe. The light it gave was more idea than presence, made weaker by water until it seemed to lit in the drops clinging to its glass. Takeshi paused under it, and under the weight of a room that had once heard only sandals, cloth, and the low voice of instruction. Kazuo's hand, in memory, closed the door to winter here once. His forearm had braced a boy's sword when the wrist had a foolish angle. His breath had forgone a word at the last moment because silence had said it more precisely. All this arrived without sound. It arrived the way fatigue arrives, suddenly, honest to the bones, without malice and without remedy. Asterisk not here. The thread said again, not as order as courtesy. He moved on. A corridor led toward the outer kitchens. The odor changed as they entered. Wet rice, scorched miso, the faint sweetness of charred leek, smoke that had lingered in straw and now fled into rain. Pots lay on their sides with their mouths to the wall, as if ashamed to have boiled the wrong water. A ladle stood upright in a hinge of door, planted there by the force of a draft that had tried to be a wind and failed. Footfalls crossed this room in dark arcs slashed with rainwater. Some prints faced inward, some outward. None told a story by themselves. Takeshi did not ask them to. Nobu coughed once and stilled it with an apology to the space, not to any person. Takeshi lifted two fingers and lowered them, a kindness to breath, not a rebuke. The boy's nod was a small weight set back into place, stopped far across the yard. A cry rose and went thin, as if the throat that made it had stepped behind a screen. A string sang, a single note that liked itself enough to repeat an echo and then stopped liking itself altogether. The ground under their feet quivered with something heavy being dropped with caution. The fortress changed nothing about itself to accommodate any of this. It had been built to account for men, not to be changed by them. The whisper thickened. At a corner where an interior stair climbed into a gallery, it suggested recollection stairs like these, a winter morning, Kazuo's footfalls ahead. The way the older brother never looked over his shoulder and yet knew precisely where the younger had placed his weight. Takeshi put his hand on the rail for a breath. The wood was wet and slick with ash. Under his palm, the grain remembered a craftsman's chisel. Under that memory, the tree remembered wind, and under that, something older than his family's name remembered rain. He removed his hand and moved on along the lower path, past a door he would not open because some doors are meant for someone else to come through first. Smoke turned the next hall into a story untold. Figures of dark and darker wavered screens with paintings of cranes that had become their own shadows. A suit of armor sat on a stand now wearing a collar of steam, a low table with a scroll half unrolled and the ink feathers creeping across it. In the scroll's abrupt curve and the way the brushstroke broke against water, he heard Kazuo's pause before speaking a vow. Not the words, the discipline that made them usable, the whisper came as an absence now. The hush he had known when his brother read a rim. It was permission, but to wait. It asked the body to do less until the hour was large enough to contain. What it would ask he turned through a small door to the garden that faced the inner keep. Rain here fell straighter, less bullied by wind. A candle had burned itself to a curl of wick in a stone niche and lay as a blackened thread. A white thing lay at the lip of a puddle, and at first he thought it a petal that had survived heat. But when he stepped near, it showed itself as a feather, the barbs wetted into one glossy blade, the shaft streaked with a soot that could not claim it. He did not take it. He let its undeserved brightness remain where the rain had set it. Hinged between omens in the world as it is. Nobu saw the feather and swallowed. his breath hitching before it remembered its task. The boy's outline shifted in the garden's faint light. A gust tumbled smoke against him and remade him, cut him into pieces and gave him back whole. His hands were more certain now. Fear had taken a smaller seat and paid attention. Ahead. Learn not to speak until spoken to. A low thunder walked the valley-only cloud, not war, and the sound touched the walls as politely as a guest, pressing hands to tatami. From deeper in the fortress, a gong sounded once, a note more ritual. Then command, as if the house had cleared its throat. The men in the yard with the shields kept to their squares. Those at the stair tested their footing in silence. The demon mask had not shown itself since dawn. Its absence had weight. Takeshi felt it not as mercy. As the stillness before papers unrolled, the whisper led him toward the keep's shadow. Then paused. He paused with it. The inner doors ahead were closed, their beam slots empty, their seams clean. Smoke ran its palms along them and found no purchase. Water traced their edges and left no hint. Behind them, men stood the sense of that standing arriving in the ear, the way a draft arrives under a door from rooms one has not seen. Takeshi did not put his hand to wood. He stood and let breath go in a measured thread. A rustle came behind, to the left, the Ronin leader moving go-slow along the gallery's far side. Spear lowered, profile turned to the inner yard as though honoring a manuscript. He saw Takeshi and did not raise a hand. He set his heel down, then his toe, then let the rain erase that small record. The look he gave the door said what all men here knew. A question had been set upon the table and was not ready to be asked aloud. They crossed the yard to a narrow way that ran along the keep's flank. Here the smoke traveled up in a close column from a storage room where something that had loved oil had accepted fire too easily. Heat brushed the cheek and withdrew. Sparks rose and died in the rain before they could become story. The corridor bent and past a side gate where a guard spear leaned without its owner. Rain finishing the polishing the owner's hand had begun. Cloth lay in the runnel gray, hardly green any longer, its edges fluttering enough to show it had once been a banner. None of this asked for a word. They were the hour's furniture. The whisper returned at a bend where the wall stones were larger, cut with more care, the mortar smooth to the touch, the way inner rooms speak of attention others do not receive. It brought with it the shape of a hand hovering over his shoulder when he was a younger man and had chosen a path 2 breaths before Kazuo would have chosen it for him. Not here, that hovering said again, but the tone altered closer now to soon dot in the next court. Rain made small nets on the surface of a shallow pool where carp hid themselves in a patience older than storm. A wooden ladle floated with its mouth up, collecting the sky. Ash stippled its inside into a night sky inverted. The walkway on the pool's far side bore a long scorch, and then none, as if the fire had licked and declined. Takeshi watched the pattern without reading too much in it, and yet took it as a note. Something had been allowed to pass here. He stepped along a clear portion and listened. From the keep's upper balcony came the faintest scrape of shoe adjusted within armor, a bowset grip corrected, the small commerce of readiness. Nobu's head turned toward it a fraction. His shoulders answered with a half-remembered hunch. Takeshi did not imitate. He let his own stillness be the correction he recognized Kazuo would have offered. Do not give too much to anyone you cannot yet see. They passed beneath the balcony and entered a hallway that gave onto the audience chamber. The door to that room stood ajar, pushed wide by heat, and then caught in its own warping so that it would not shut without complaint. Smoke had settled here into a thinner layer, making the world 1 degree dimmer, as though a cloud had stretched itself indoors and gotten comfortable. Tatami had blistered near the threshold, then dried and knit themselves back to a usability. That would not last the week. At the far end, a screen painted with cranes sat askew, their wings blurred by ash until they looked like storm, not birds. He remembered kneeling in this room while rain still wrote the winter at its windows. Remembered the scent of cedar oil and the blank face of Kensei reading with a firmness no ink captures. He remembered Dago's gloves pinching when folded over a scroll, and how the scroll had bent to resemble a mouth kept shut. None of these things walked the room now. They lived where the hour had opened in him and breathed at its pace. The whisper felt nearer here, though it did not speak. It gathered behind his ribs and took shape as a readiness to say yes to something that had not yet become a question. He stood at the threshold and let the smoke move past, through around, as if it were a stream learning him and finding him suited to the stones it already knew. Nobu paused at his back and breathed, through the cloth drawn across his nose and mouth. The cloth darkened with moisture and narrowed his breath, and still he held to it. The way a man holds to a rule meant to preserve sense when feeling persuades one to run ahead. He watched Takeshi's profile fix upon a point that had nothing visible at it and learned again how to stand without demand, that the room's silence had different weights. In one corner lay a weight of old politeness, chairs low to the floor, cushions hastily set back into order, a teapot that had poured itself out before fleeing heat. In another lay the weight of suspicion, the air thinner where counsel had been, given and taken away. In the center, where the matting was less marked, a simple absence, the space people keep when expecting someone to enter. Not a ghost, but a person with a name everyone knows and no one speaks. The emptiness was courteous, and that courtesy was its sharpest edge. A gust pushed new smoke through the breach and across the threshold. It flowed like cloth and climbed the frame and poured itself into the room's upper corners, where darkness meets rafters. For a breath, the upward flow drew the whisper clear, not as words, but as a string tautened. In that silence, he heard Kazuo, the way a blind man hears light by warmth on the skin, a presence that completes the body without asking it to move. He turned away, not to refuse it, to keep it. A side door led toward the inner stair. He took it. The stair rose in a shallow spiral, the wood worn by years of respectable footsteps. Smoke traveled there in slow columns, grateful for the shelter. The rain's roar became a hush. The steps sounded like pages turned. At the first landing, he stopped because the whisper stopped, and stood because the whisper stood, and waited because the hour's hinge had not yet accepted the pin he would slide through at Nobu. You reached the landing, and stood beside him. The boy's eyes shone in the half-light, catching ash the way dew catches dust. His hands tightened once, and then settled into the shapes that would serve him better, one on the scabbard, one free and loose, ready not for striking, but for opening or closing, for taking or giving, for moving something that would not otherwise move. His breath found the stair's rhythm and borrowed it. He made no sound. From below, the Ronin's murmur continued, low and thread-like. From above, a new quiet assembled, the kind that lives in rooms where paper holds more power than blade. Until blade arrives. The rain spoke around the keep's eaves without going in, and this too seemed like a kind of courtesy. In that enclosing pause, Takeshi felt the whisper change. It did not fade. It became his own breath. It was not a marvel. It was the small, clean alignment that happens when a man stops arguing with the part of himself that remembers. Kazuo was not present. He was present enough. He was the habit of the hand lifted from a wrist at the right moment, the patience that stilled a tongue when the best sentence would be uttered by walking, the weight in the room that made fools measure their words and men measure their steps. Takeshi breathed that weight in and let it become the air he needed most. He did not speak. He did not reach for the blade. He stepped up one more stair, and the smoke thinned in front of him, as if the stair itself had taken a breath and released it. Nobu rose with him, and the two became silhouettes in the stairs. Slow light, one straight, steady, accepting. The other taut, blurred, faithful. The clash of steel that lived elsewhere softened again, the way echoes do when the space between walls widens. The fortress gathered itself somewhere above. Cloth moved against iron, a sleeve brushed a plate, and the sound came down like the first drop after a storm announces itself in the distance. Takeshi lifted his head to where the sound had been and let it go. He felt, as one feels a promise made in a field years ago, that the hour had put its hand on his shoulder and would not remove it until the task it had saved for him was done. Not because he deserved it, because it had waited for him. He climbed the last risers into the hall that ran along the keep's upper rooms. Windows slit the stone and showed rain as narrow lines of white. The air had less smoke here, more ink. The smell of screens and scrolls, of straw cushions kept sheltered, of wood that had not learned fire's language and did not intend to today. The hush balanced itself between two expectations and chose neither dot behind him. Nobu entered with his young quiet, and the whisper, if it could be said to have a place, settled in the space between them, a thread drawn through two needles, pulling them toward the same cloth. Takeshi paused with one palm open to the air ahead and one hand near the knot that remembered the sword. He did not touch it. He listened. He felt somewhere not far the absence that has a mask. He let the absence know without words that he had arrived. Smoke drifted into the hall like old advice, soft, uninsistent, offering shape without forcing it. The rain outside kept the steadiness men envy. The voices below made their woven murmur and did not tear. The fortress, breached and yet intact, held both outcome and intention in one bowl and passed it from room to room without spilling. Takeshi took one more step and another, and the whisper moved with him, thin as a breath, strong as a vow folded and put away where weather cannot reach. Nobu followed, the scabbard's mouth under his thumb, a small moon he carried through his own weather. They went on in the hall where names gain weight and words become edges, and the smoke, the faintest echo of a brother's presence, kept them to their measure, no faster, no slower, until the morning could bear the meeting that had waited, patient as rain, within these walls. The fortress had learned the voice of ruin. It spoke in burning roof beams that sighed as they settled, and banners sodden and humbled on the stones, and water running through halls that had once arranged the behavior of rain. Tatami buckled at the edges where a slow fire tasted them and changed its mind. Lacquered screens leaned in a confusion of angles, their painted cranes washed to smoke-gray silhouettes. A corridor sent a slender river toward a courtyard where ash fell through. The downpour like tired snow. Men moved in pieces of noise steel finding wood, and being refused, a low order cut short by a gust. The footfalls of many making one unsteady drum, and then their noise fell away as if the building itself had decided which walls would be allowed to listen. Takeshi stepped from the smoke-dim hallway into the great hall, and the house closed its mouth around him. Sound thinned, grew orderly, placed itself along the edges like attendants who would not intrude. The width of the room declared itself even in ruin. Stone pillars lifted the ceiling as if weighing it for judgment. Shutters hung broken on one side where a blast of weather had forced them to learn a new grammar, and through their torn lattice the morning showed lightning by increments, white drawings across the ribs of cloud, hieroglyphs that did not require translation. Thunder answered somewhere else in the fortress, arrived in the hall as a broad hand placed upon a drum, and then left the room to itself. On the floor lay banners stripped from their careful heights, cloth soaked until crest and field had collapsed. Into one color, the silk's old pride flattened to a dull sheen. They lay like creatures that had swum too long against a river and let the current place them where it would. Water fell from the rafters in thin, unwavering strands. Each strand found a bowl of pooled rain in a crease of mat or in the cup of a fallen helmet, and filled it with the patience of a scribe working a long roll. Smoke bled in from a doorway and curled toward the beam where wind took it the length of the room and set it free. He halted in the room's center with his weight, made modest by the size of the space. The sword at his side read the air and remained untroubled. His hand took its rightful place near the knot without claiming it. The brim of his hat shed a steady circle, the drops landing within the locust that his steps had made, as if marking an island where he would be asked to stand until the weather of men grew clear. Underfoot, the matting had learned water and answered, his solace with a soft, even resistance, each fiber giving the smallest courtesy and then taking itself back. The hall's silence was not absence but ceremony. It held the noises of other rooms as a lake holds the hills it reflects, without breaking them, without letting them enter. Beneath the rafters, the day's pale light had weight. It pressed the color from wood and left structure, admitting grain and joinery and the old decisions of carpenters who had thought in minds no storm could alter. A line of ink had once lived here, an axis that governed where men would kneel and where they would stand to speak. Ash had dusted it and rain had carried it toward the drains cut into the floor's corners. What remained was a darker path that I could follow without being asked to. He closed his eyes and the hall did not change. It entered him by another door. He heard the soft hammer of water in the rafters, the thin applause of drops into a helm, the slow breathing of a fire that had found no fuel worth its pride and settled to watch. Under these, he heard what the storm had been hiding in him since the first step on the mountain path, the weather that does not fall from the sky. Kazuo walked there, not as a shade given leave by smoke, not as a trick of wind, but as a way of holding a room that the younger brother had worn like an old garment. He remembered the slope of a winter afternoon when Kazuo had corrected a novice's stance without word, lifting 2 fingers and waiting until the body remembered its own instruction. He remembered the weight of his brother's palm on his shoulder. After a day neither of them had wanted, and the small truth that passed through that touch: we are not excused. We are not undone. The memory brought no comfort. It was something stricter than comfort, a measure laid gently against the wrist. Sori's sentence sounded again, not whispered now, but present the way a rule is present when the mouth is shut. Around it, the silence will break with blood, and the blade that rests will awaken. He considered the words the way a man considers a seal he might press into wax, not for ornament, for consequence. He did not argue with prophecy. He had learned that prophecy is a mirror that returns whatever face is held before it. Thunder walked the beams and set dust floating. Lightning came through the broken shutters and unrolled the Roman white, laid each pillar's curve and each drop's fall, and each torn banner flat for a heartbeat, and then folded it all again into gray. In that brief clarity he could have counted the fibers on a thread about his knot. He could have read the faint brushwork on a panel half charred to silence. He could have measured the distance to each door by the angle of light. He counted nothing. He let the fold hold him. He felt Nobu before he saw him, a quietness in the wake of smoke, a silhouette with edges that had not yet learned to deceive. The boy came to his half-step behind and left, the old position that had become a truth of their bodies, and set his weight upon the mats as if entering a sanctuary where feet asked permission first. He did not speak. His breath, narrowed by ash and widened by resolve, took its place among the hall's other measures. Between them, the things that had been entrusted oaths given under rain, the first clean fear accepted and not excused, the small acts of courage that preferred to remain unnamed rose like steam and hung without obscuring anything. The oath Nobu had spoken by the stormed rocks returned here with a steadier voice. The prophecy wore its patience without show. Kazuo's absence made a room, and the room gave shape to the present moment until it could stand up under its own weight. He moved his hand an inch closer to the knot, and memory answered with the restraint his brother had taught. Not yet, not. For noise, not for proof. For the one breath that asks you to be exact. He felt the blade as a thought covered in cloth. He felt the hall ask him whether he would bring it into the world where words are weighed and not thrown. He let the question remain where questions belong, near the tongue, far from the mouth. The phantom general entered without entering. The demon's iron mouth was not in the room. Yet the stillness that had stood on the parapet pressed upon the hall with the same cool authority, as if a void had chosen to sit at the far end and allowed men to discover it by what it did to the furniture of their thoughts. A strip of black lacquer on a fallen screen caught the lightning and returned it in a line exactly the angle of a jaw. A wet cord puddled near a pillar wrote a crooked grin. A rivet head in the floor showed a damp brightness where a tooth might have shone. These coincidences arranged themselves with the laziness of fate. He had no need of omens. He knew what had taken shape inside the gate's mouth and on the wall's lip. He knew the posture of the hour as one recognizes weather by smell. The hall breathed him toward decision and then away again. He stood. He let grief place itself under his sternum, a weight neither heavy nor light, merely correct. He let loyalty come beside it and be asked its true name, which is sometimes the house in which it chooses to sit. He let destiny whisper the old lie that it requires only acceptance, and answered with the truth his brother had lived. Destiny requires work. The storm outside wrote these lines upon the floor with water and ash. The storm inside read them. Nobu settled his stance and did not open his hand. The boy's presence was a candle out of wind small, alive, offering light that refused to burn anything it touched. In him, Takeshi heard the echo of all vows when spoken by new throats, the clean overreach, the willingness to carry beyond strength, the humility that creeps in when strength ends and the work does not. The oath did not bind Takeshi. It unbound him from the need to be not seen, from the need to answer hurt with noise, from the need to pick a door because it is open. He could now choose the correct door, even if it had not yet learned to admit. Lightning jarred the shutters again. For one lean heartbeat, the banners on the mat looked like riverbeds drawn in chalk, the torn edges their banks. Drops fell in lines that could have been script. Thunder pressed upon the roof, and the roof took its pressure the way a hand accepts a friend's weight at the shoulder without sitting. Fire far down the corridor took a breath and held it. The hall made of all this a music without instruments, a measure with no singer, a ritual without priest. He had walked one war after another to arrive at this room where he was asked to wait. He felt the absurdity of it and let it wash him clean of impatience. Waiting is an act. Doing nothing is not. He took the waiting into his shoulders and gave it the steadiness of a man who has carried burdens that belonged to him and refused those that did not. He felt Kazuo near in the way a smell from a winter kitchen changes the angle of a man's head. He felt Sayori's breath somewhere beyond the smoke, not instructing, reminding, a storm that gathers not from heaven but from men. It was not a warning now. It was an inventory dot within the inventory lived the phantom silence, long and exact. A length of cloth that could be cut into decisions as required. Takeshi put his hand upon the cloth and found it cool. He did not cut. He measured dot rain threaded into the hall and made of itself a small river along the ink-dark line where petitions had once been placed. The edge of that river lapped at a banner's fringe and moved the silk as if teaching a breath to a sleeping chest. He watched it and understood the sentence it wrote without grammar. Things made to stand may be asked to lie. Things made to lie may be asked to stand. This is not treachery. It is weather. He moved a single step. The mat took his measure anew. He turned his head enough to let the broken windows into the corner of his sight. Gray day waited there, not ready to be called morning. Beyond them, a courtyard went about the work of admitting rain into the plan of its stones. The echoes that should have belonged to victory did not come. The fortress had not taken a side. It had yielded space and held its name. He admired the house for that and pitied no one. Within, the storm shifted. Its clouds were memory. Its rain was an old instruction repeating itself through new mouths. Its lightning was the quick knowledge that joins the hand to the thing it must do without the chatter of fear or praise. He let the lightning pass through him and refused to scorch. He let the rain cool him and refused to drown. He allowed the thunder to name itself an echo and refused to be the drum. Nobu took a breath. That scraped. He steadied it. His young weight came a half-pace nearer, not crowding, anchoring. In that slight movement, the oath breathed again, not as promise, as practice. It asked nothing more of Takeshi than that he be a correct thing in a correct place, at a correct time. The simplicity of that demand was its severity. He set his palm lightly upon the knot that held the blade, and felt the cloth's wetness return to him a plain fact. Everything here was subject to weather. The blade itself was not. Steel keeps its climate. It would answer only the hand that asked with completeness. He knew the room steel could not enter, and the room steel must. The hall was both. Thunder walked again, closer, as if trying the floor to see where it would bear. The windows shone white, and in that lift Nobu's profile sharpened, a young line made honest by fear and made useful by training. The light folded, leaving behind the faint afterimage of the boy's brow and the straightness of his neck. Takeshi let pride move through him and made no sound to cheapen it. He thought of the first ridge, of banners that had looked like cold stars through rain, of the long patience that had worn his steps thin until they became quiet, of the priestess, who had never once told him anything he did not already know, and had given it back to him with a shape he could carry. He thought of the demon grin above the gate, and the stillness that had taken the wall's weight as if born for it. He thought of the ram's blows, counting the hour into the wood, of the seam opening and accepting rain and smoke and men. He thought of the letter he had never written and had burned invisibly in a ruined farmhouse, the sparks rising into a dark that had been kind enough to keep them. All of it arranged itself in him with the economy of a house set for guests who would attend without eating. He could feel the path that would take him forward into rooms where the phantom had left his silence folded, like a garment on a chair. He could feel the path that would take him aside into halls where men waited to explain. He could feel the path that would take him back to the gate and the field and the old work that never ends. He could take any of these. Fate, polite today, refused to place a hand between his shoulders. The hall's silence reformed like a flock after a hawk passes. Somewhere a cup rolled, found a groove, and stopped with the sound of bone knocking wood in a winter story. Water fell, smoke climbed. The great house remembered it was a house even when asked to be a battlefield. Under his hand, the knot held. He did not draw. He did not rest. He stood in the storm within and let it finish saying what it needed to say before. It would allow hands to move of their own accord. The storm answered not with lightning, with a clear space where lightning had been. In that cleared air, he found the edge between grief and loyalty and stood with one foot on each side, as if straddling a narrow creek where both banks are the same soil. He did not choose. He awaited the one true question, Nobu's presence at. His side grew lighter and steadier, as though the boy had found a stone under the flood and set himself upon it. The cloth at Nobu's mouth fell. He did not need it for breath now. He turned his head the smallest degree, the inclination a student makes when he is asked to hold a position until the muscle accepts it as normal. Takeshi felt that acceptance and let it touch his own. A draft moved along the floor. stirred the soaked banners, and lifted the corner of one so that the crest showed, stubborn die clinging to the idea it had been made to defend. He watched it settle back into the matting and understood that ideas are what banners keep when wind deserts them. He took that into the room, where his brother still sat with patience, and laid it down beside the prophecy and the oath and the silence wearing a demon's mouth. None jostled the others. Each waited its turn, generous as rain-thunder stepped back, as if bowing from the threshold. Lightning faded to a rumor at the windows. Rain kept to its ledger. The hall, having raised the storm within to its last height, offered no resolution. It offered only the ordinary miracle of a man exactly where he should be when decision chooses him. Not he. Takeshi lifted his gaze to the broken lattice and the strip of sky beyond, and let his breath out in a line as straight as a calligrapher's first stroke. His hand stayed near the blade, neither inviting nor denying it. The room held a hush that could become any of a dozen acts and not be wrong. Nobu waited, his quiet made strong by use. The banners slept, the windows blood rain. The house listened so. Did he die in the storm within, having spent itself without spectacle, settled into a calm that was not peace but readiness, the surface of a river just before a boat glides from shadow into open water, the held breath before a seal meets wax, the last unmarked page before the brush touches and gives the hour its name.